I never used to be afraid of the woods. It started as a solo trip. I'd hiked plenty of times before, but I always had someone with me. This time, I wanted to challenge myself, to test my endurance, my instincts. A 3-day trek through a remote section of national forest, away from the crowds, just me and the wilderness. It sounded perfect. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon. The sky was overcast, but the weather forecast promised clear skies for the next few days. My pack was heavier than I liked, but I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit. I double-checked my gear, locked my car, and set off. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense trees, mostly pine and oak. The occasional bird call broke the silence. I found it peaceful. The isolation, the quiet, this was what I came for. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite near a small stream. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and made a small fire. Dinner was a simple meal of dehydrated food, washed down with cool water from the stream. As the sun dipped lower, the woods turned darker, the trees casting long shadows. I felt a slight unease, but I brushed it off. First nights always felt a little strange when camping alone. I turned in early, exhausted from the hike. The sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, lulled me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not an animal scampering. These were slow, steady. I held my breath, listening. My hand reached for my knife just in case. The footsteps stopped near my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I finally unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My headlamp beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing. Just trees and the dim glow of my dying fire. I sat there for a long time, listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a deer or some other animal. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. No tracks, no signs of anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, standing just outside my tent, watching. I pushed the thought aside and packed up. Day 2 was supposed to be the hardest leg of the hike, with steep inclines and rough terrain. I focused on that, trying to put the night behind me. The trail became less distinct the further I went. It was marked, but barely. A faded blaze on a tree here, a stack of rocks there. I had a map and GPS, but even with those, I had to stop often to make sure I was on the right path. By mid-afternoon, I started feeling off. The air felt heavier. The forest seemed quieter than before. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then I saw the first one, a shoe, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. It looked old, weathered by rain and time, but something about it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there. I hesitated, then walked past it. People lost things on hikes all the time. I told myself that, but a few minutes later, I saw something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, a backpack strap, broken and lying in the dirt. I stopped. My heart was pounding. Maybe there had been an accident, a lost hiker, but then why hadn't I heard about it? Why wasn't there a search party or signs warning people? I pressed on, faster now. The sooner I reached my next campsite, the better. I found it just before sunset, a small clearing near a rocky outcrop. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. I ate without really tasting my food, my ears straining for any sound beyond the crackle of my fire. Then, just as the last light faded, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they weren't slow. They were moving quickly, circling my campsite. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My knife was in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. The footsteps stopped just beyond the firelight. I could feel someone there, watching, waiting. I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse. If someone's there, I have a weapon. Nothing. I stayed up all night, my back against a tree, knife in hand. The footsteps never came closer, but they didn't leave either. Every so often, I'd hear a rustle, a shift in the darkness, but nothing ever stepped into the light. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up and left. I didn't eat.
He barely drank.
I just walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The trail felt different. The markers I had followed before seemed off, wrong. I checked my GPS constantly, but I felt like I was going in circles. Then I saw something ahead, a figure, standing in the trees, not moving. I stopped. My body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still, to look. It wasn't a person. It was a jacket draped over a broken branch. But for a moment, I could have sworn someone had been standing there. I grabbed the jacket on impulse. It was damp, dirty. The pockets were empty except for a scrap of paper, too smudged to read. I dropped it and kept moving. By midday, I found a landmark I recognized. Relief flooded through me. I was back on the right path. I hiked faster, ignoring the ache in my legs. The last stretch of the hike was a blur. I didn't stop until I saw the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I left it. I locked the doors the second I got inside. As I drove away, I told myself I was done with solo hikes. Later, I checked the area online. There were no reports of missing hikers, no unsolved cases, no warnings, but I know what I heard, what I felt. Something or someone was out there, and I don't think I was supposed to leave. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It was a solo trip, just me in the mountains, a chance to clear my head and get away from the constant noise of daily life. The trail I had picked was one of those lesser-known ones, a narrow path winding through dense forest and up into the hills, far away from the more popular, well-traveled routes. I had checked the maps, the weather, packed everything I needed, extra food, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't an expert either. Just cautious, careful. The first few hours of the hike were peaceful. The air was crisp, and the trees were tall, their trunks stretching up into the sky, blocking most of the sunlight. The only sounds were my own footsteps crunching on the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves from some unseen animal moving through the underbrush. The trail was barely more than a footpath, winding deeper into the wilderness. I had no cell service, but that was expected. I had my GPS, my compass. I wasn't worried. The trouble started when I reached the ridgeline. The climb had been steeper than I expected, the ground uneven, filled with loose rocks. I took a break, drank some water, looked out over the trees below. The sky was starting to turn, the first hints of late afternoon creeping in. I checked my map. The plan was to follow the trail up a little further before looping back down on another path, a longer but less steep descent. I should have turned back then, but I told myself I had time. Not long after I started moving again, I noticed something was off. The trail looked different, less defined. I told myself I was just overthinking it, that maybe the wind had blown leaves over the path, or maybe I had veered a little without noticing. I had my GPS, but the signal was spotty, the screen slow to update. I kept moving, trusting that the path would become clearer the further I went. Didn't. The more I walked, the less familiar things seemed. The trees all looked the same, towering and dense. I started to get the uneasy feeling that I had left the trail without realizing it. I stopped, took a deep breath, tried to calm myself. I pulled out my compass. If I headed west, I should eventually hit the main trail again. I started walking. 10 minutes, then 20. The trees didn't change. The sun was getting lower, the shadows stretching out, making the forest darker. I kept checking my GPS, but it wasn't picking up a clear signal. I switched to my compass, kept going. Another 20 minutes passed, and there was still no sign of the trail. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own boot prints. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I crouched down, ran my fingers through the dirt. The impression was fresh. I had walked in a circle. Panic started creeping in. I forced myself to think. I wasn't in immediate danger. I had supplies, I had light. I just needed to keep my head clear. I tried again, this time marking the trees with my knife, small cuts in the bark so I could tell if I passed the same place again. The forest was growing darker, and I still wasn't any closer to finding the trail. I had to stop for the night. I found a small clearing, cleared the ground, set up my emergency bivouac. I ate some food, tried to ignore the gnawing worry in my gut. The night was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling, no distant animal calls. Just thick, heavy stillness. I forced myself to sleep. I woke up to the sound of movement. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffling, like something moving through the underbrush. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, but then it stopped, completely, like whoever or whatever was moving had realized I was awake. I stayed still, gripping my knife. Minutes passed. Nothing. I listened, straining my ears, but the forest was dead silent again. Eventually, I let myself breathe, told myself I was imagining things. Lack of sleep, stress, paranoia. I closed my eyes again. The next morning, I packed up and started walking. I was exhausted, hungry, but I needed to keep moving. I checked my compass, adjusted my direction. The forest was still dense, but I told myself I would find the trail soon. And then I saw them. More boot prints, but they weren't mine. They were fresher. Someone else was out here. Someone I hadn't seen, hadn't heard. My chest tightened. I followed them for a few yards before stopping. They didn't lead anywhere, just stopped abruptly, like whoever made them had vanished. I didn't waste time thinking about it. I turned and walked faster, then ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get away. The trees blurred past me. My legs ached. My lungs burned. But I didn't stop until I stumbled onto a wider, more defined path. A real trail. I almost collapsed from relief. I checked my map and realized I was miles from where I should have been. But it didn't matter. I followed the trail, pushing myself until, finally, I saw the first signs of civilization. A wooden signpost, an old trail marker. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I locked the doors, sat there shaking, trying to process everything. I still don't know what happened out there. If I was just lost, if my own fear had made me imagine things. But those footprints weren't mine, and I wasn't alone. I had always loved hiking. There was something about the quiet solitude of the forest, the feeling of being surrounded by nature with nothing but my own 2 feet carrying me forward. It was a way to clear my mind, to escape the endless hum of city life and find peace in the wilderness. I had hiked countless trails over the years, from well-worn paths close to home to deep, remote sections of national parks where I wouldn't see another person for miles. But this particular hike was different. It started as a normal trip. I had planned for a 2-day solo hike through a lesser-known section of a vast forest reserve. The trail was supposed to be moderately challenging, but nothing beyond my abilities. I had packed everything I needed: food, water, extra clothing, a tent, a GPS, a map, and a knife just in case. I had checked the weather forecast, noted potential dangers like wild animals, and told a friend about my plans. I was confident and prepared. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. I could hear birds chirping, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. The air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine. I felt good, strong. I made steady progress, stopping only for brief water breaks. As the day wore on, the trail became more difficult. The incline grew steeper, and large roots and rocks jutted out from the ground, forcing me to be careful with every step. The forest also became denser. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting long shadows that made the path ahead look darker than it should have been. My GPS showed I was still on track, but I had this nagging feeling that I wasn't. I brushed it off as paranoia. Then I found the first sign that something was wrong. A torn backpack, half buried in the dirt just off the trail. It was old, covered in moss and leaves, the fabric shredded as if something had clawed at it. I knelt down, brushing away the debris, and saw that the straps had been sliced cleanly, not torn by an animal. Cut. My stomach tightened. I stood up quickly, glancing around. The forest was silent now. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. I took a deep breath, telling myself that it could have been anything. An old backpack someone had abandoned, maybe a hiker who had an accident years ago, but still something felt off. I kept moving, walking a little faster. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I needed to find a spot to camp soon. The trail had become less defined, and I had to rely more on my map and GPS to stay on course. I finally found a small clearing that looked safe enough. I set up my tent quickly, ate a protein bar, and made sure my knife was within easy reach before settling in for the night. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves. My heart pounded. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, another slow step. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A deer? Something else? I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on and pointing it toward the thin fabric of my tent. The light barely illuminated anything beyond my immediate area. I didn't dare unzip the tent. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, suddenly, the footsteps started again. This time faster, moving away from my tent, deeper into the forest. I sat there, gripping my knife, listening until I could no longer hear anything. I barely slept after that. At first light, I packed up and started hiking again, determined to get back to safer ground. But the trail was different now. It was as if the forest had changed overnight. The path seemed less clear, more overgrown. The trees felt taller, pressing in closer. My GPS was still working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Then I saw the second sign. Footprints. Not mine. Not animal tracks. Human footprints, deep in the soft earth, leading off the trail into the thick underbrush. But what made my stomach turn was the fact that the prints were fresh. Someone had been walking barefoot through the forest, right near my campsite, sometime during the night. I walked faster. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Every so often, I would glance behind me, convinced I would see someone standing in the distance, watching. But there was never anything there. Just the trees, the shadows, and that suffocating silence. After hours of hiking, I finally saw something familiar. An old wooden marker that I remembered passing on my way in. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't lost. I was almost out. Then I heard it. A sharp, deliberate whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, ignoring the burning in my legs, the branches that scraped at my skin, the roots that threatened to trip me. I could hear something behind me. Footsteps, fast and heavy, matching my pace. When I finally broke through the tree-line and saw my car parked at the trailhead, I didn't stop. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, locked it, and sat there, panting, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. And whoever it was, they had been following me the whole time. I never went back to that trail. I had always loved hiking. The feeling of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature, was something I found peaceful. It was my way of getting away from everything: work, people, noise. Just me and the trail. I had done dozens of solo hikes before, but this one would be different. I had chosen a remote trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't well known, and that was what I liked about it. I had read a few scattered reviews online. Some people said it was difficult, others said it was beautiful, but there wasn't much else. That only added to the appeal. I packed up everything I needed: plenty of food, water, a flashlight, a compass, and a small knife, just in case. My phone had a map of the area downloaded in case I lost my way, but I didn't expect to need it. I had done this enough times to trust myself. The hike started off just like any other. The morning air was crisp, the sky was clear, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird overhead. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was overgrown in some places, but it was still easy to follow. There was no one else around, which was exactly what I wanted. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I started to notice how quiet it had become. It wasn't unusual for forests to be silent at times, but this was different. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. It felt like I had stepped into a place where nothing else existed. The further I walked, the worse the feeling got. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A backpack sitting right in the middle of the trail. It looked weathered, like it had been there for a while. The fabric was dirty, the zippers rusted. I stopped and stared at it. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no footprints leading to or away from it. It was just there, as if someone had left it and disappeared. I hesitated before stepping closer. Part of me wanted to leave it alone and keep walking, but the other part knew I couldn't just ignore it. I nudged it with my foot, half expecting something to jump out of it. Nothing happened. Slowly, I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, there were clothes, a few empty food wrappers, and a notebook. The clothes were faded, but not completely ruined. Whoever owned this bag hadn't been gone that long. I picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages. Most of it was unreadable. The ink had smudged from moisture, but one page stood out. "Do not go further." That was all it said. Nothing else. Just those 4 words, written over and over again in shaky handwriting. I felt a chill run through me. Could have been a joke, someone messing around. But it didn't feel that way. Felt like a warning. I looked around again. The trees were thick, and the sunlight barely made it through the canopy. I suddenly felt exposed, like I was being watched. I shoved the notebook back into the bag and stood up. My first thought was to turn around and head back, but I had come this far. Turning back over an abandoned backpack and some creepy writing seemed ridiculous, so I kept going. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence pressed down on me, heavier than before. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone behind me, but there was never anything there. Then I saw it, a second backpack. It was off to the side of the trail, half hidden behind some bushes. It looked just like the first one, worn, abandoned. I felt my heart start to pound. This wasn't normal. People didn't just leave their backpacks behind like this. Something was very wrong. I didn't check this one. I just kept moving. The trail started to climb steeply, and I focused on my footing, trying to push away the unease crawling up my spine. But then I noticed something else. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp dirt, heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped and stared at them. The strange thing was they weren't spaced normally. It was as if whoever made them had been moving strangely, their steps erratic. Some were deep, as if they had been standing still for a long time before taking another step. I felt my stomach twist. I wasn't alone out here. I forced myself to keep moving, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the trees. The footprints continued ahead of me, and the more I followed them, the more unsettling they became. Some of them overlapped like the person had been pacing in circles. Others trailed off into the woods and disappeared. Then they stopped, right in the middle of the trail. There was no sign of where the person had gone. No side trails, no footprints leading away. Just an abrupt stop, like they had been lifted off the ground. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the last print. Then I heard it, a rustling in the trees. Not the wind, something else, something moving. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and started walking back the way I came, moving fast but careful not to break into a run. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but I knew running would only make things worse. The silence was gone now. I could hear movement behind me, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Something was following me. I forced myself to keep my pace steady, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sounds were getting closer. I reached into my pocket and gripped my knife, even though I had no idea what good it would do. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking, every muscle in my body tense. The trail stretched ahead of me, and I focused on that. My breathing was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched. I practically ran to it, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't check to see if anything was there. I just drove. I never went back to that trail. I don't know who left those backpacks, or what happened to the people who owned them. I don't know who or what was out there with me, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I was not alone in those woods, and whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. I had always been a fan of hiking, but I preferred to do it alone. Something about the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being so far away from everything. It gave me a sense of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. So, when I had a long weekend coming up, I decided to head out to a remote trail I had read about online. It wasn't the most popular spot, which made it even better. No crowded paths, no noisy groups, just me and the wilderness. The drive out took a few hours, and as I left the main road, the landscape became more rugged. The last stretch was a dirt road winding through dense forest, my tires kicking up dust as I made my way to the trailhead. I parked my car in a small clearing, grabbed my backpack, checked my gear one last time, and set off. The first few miles were exactly what I had hoped for. Dense trees, the sound of birds, the occasional rustling in the underbrush as a small animal darted away. The trail itself was barely more than a footpath, winding through the thick forest, sometimes climbing steeply, sometimes leveling out. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the feeling of solitude. I didn't see another person, and that suited me just fine. As the hours passed, I reached a more elevated part of the trail where the trees thinned out, giving me a breathtaking view of the valley below. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and I decided it was time to find a spot to set up camp. I wasn't in a hurry. I had planned to spend the night out here, maybe even two if I felt like it. I found a small clearing a little ways off the trail, surrounded by trees but open enough to give me a good view of the sky. Setting up my tent took only a few minutes, and after gathering some wood, I had a small fire going. I sat there, eating a simple meal, listening to the crackling flames and the distant sounds of the forest. The temperature started to drop as the sun disappeared, and soon the only light came from the fire and my small lantern. That was when I first noticed it, the sound of something moving in the distance. It was faint, just barely audible over the usual nighttime sounds. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger moving through the underbrush. But as I listened, the sound didn't fade. It seemed to be getting closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The firelight only reached so far, leaving the edges of the clearing in darkness. The sound stopped suddenly, and I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding. Nothing, just shadows and the occasional flicker of light as the fire danced. I tried to shake it off. It was probably my imagination, heightened by being alone out here. I told myself that if it was an animal, it had already moved on, and if it was a person, well, what were the chances someone else would be all the way out here? I forced myself to relax and climbed into my tent, zipping it up behind me. I left the fire burning low, figuring it would keep any curious animals away. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a noise just outside my tent. My eyes shot open, and I lay there, frozen. It was close, too close. A soft rustling, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the grass. I reached for my flashlight with shaky hands and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. I expected to see the shadow of an animal moving past, but instead, I saw nothing. The noise had stopped the moment the light came on. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any hint of movement. Minutes passed. Then, just as I was starting to think it had been a dream, something scraped against the side of my tent. A slow, deliberate drag, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed the knife I always kept with me when camping, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, my knife still in my hand. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check outside. The fire had burned out, leaving only a pile of ashes. The clearing looked untouched. No footprints, no signs that anything or anyone had been there. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. I had planned for a longer hike, but suddenly, being out here alone didn't seem like such a great idea. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I would stop and listen, convinced I heard something moving in the trees. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. I hiked faster, my heart pounding. I just wanted to get back to my car. The further I went, the stronger the feeling became. It was irrational, I knew that, but I couldn't ignore it. The last mile was a blur of rapid footsteps and stolen glances over my shoulder. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside and jumped in, locking the doors as if that would somehow protect me from whatever was out there. I started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by signs of civilization. Only then did I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I told myself it was nothing, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there, and it had been watching me. And the worst part? It had never made a sound when it left. Hiking had always been my way of clearing my mind. I wasn't a professional, but I was experienced enough to handle myself on the trails. I preferred solo hikes, long and deep into the wilderness, where the noise of civilization faded away. That was the plan when I set out on a 3-day solo trek through a national forest I hadn't explored before. It was early autumn, the air cool but not cold, and the trees were just starting to turn shades of red and gold. I packed carefully, enough food and water to last me, a tent, sleeping bag, emergency gear, and my knife. I had a map of the area and a GPS, but I also carried a compass just in case. I wasn't reckless, but I liked the solitude. There was something about being completely alone in the woods that made me feel more like myself. The first day went smoothly. The trail was well marked, winding through dense trees that opened up occasionally to reveal breathtaking views of rolling hills. I saw a few other hikers early on, but by midday, I was alone. I set up camp near a small stream and enjoyed the quiet, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The second day, I decided to go off the marked trail. Not far, just enough to explore a bit more of the untouched wilderness. The map showed a large rocky outcrop a few miles from the trail, and I wanted to see the view from there. I checked my GPS and compass, marking my starting point before heading in. The terrain was tougher, the undergrowth thicker, but I enjoyed the challenge. After about an hour, I reached the outcrop. The view was worth it. Rolling hills stretching for miles, the tops of trees blending together in a sea of orange and green. I took a few pictures, had a snack, and decided to rest before heading back. The sun was still high, and I had plenty of time. That was when I noticed something off. The forest was too quiet. The wind had died down, and the birds had stopped chirping. It wasn't an immediate change, more like something I only noticed after it had already happened. A deep stillness settled over everything. I had felt this kind of silence before, usually when a predator was nearby. I scanned the area, my hand resting on my knife, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had just zoned out for a while and hadn't noticed the gradual quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I packed up and started back toward the trail, moving faster than before. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth, leading from the direction I had just come from. Someone else had been up here recently, but I hadn't seen anyone. And what was stranger, the footprints didn't lead away. They stopped, right where I was standing. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. My logical brain tried to explain it. Maybe the person had doubled back over their own prints, or maybe I just wasn't seeing the full trail. But I knew how to track, and these prints didn't make sense. I moved quickly, heading back the way I came. The silence followed me, pressing against my ears. I glanced behind me more than once, but I saw nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail. Relief flooded through me. I turned in the direction of my campsite and kept walking, forcing myself to calm down. Then I smelled it, a strong, pungent odor, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. It was coming from up ahead, near my campsite. My gut clenched, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I broke through the trees, my stomach dropped. My campsite was wrecked. My tent was slashed open, my gear scattered. My food bag had been ripped apart, the contents spilled out and left to rot. But what made my blood turn to ice was what was carved into the tree beside my tent. A single word, deep and deliberate. Leave. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I scanned the area, my knife gripped so tight my fingers ached. There was no one in sight, but I no longer felt alone. I grabbed what I could, my map, compass, GPS, and emergency gear, shoving them into my pack. My water bottle was still intact, and I took a deep swallow, trying to calm myself. I left everything else. I just needed to get out. I took the fastest route back toward the trailhead, moving as quickly as I could without running. Every noise made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me. As the sun began to set, I realized I wouldn't make it out before dark. I had two choices: stop for the night or push through. I didn't want to risk injuring myself in the dark, so I found a spot near a cluster of rocks and hunkered down. That night was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig sent my heart into overdrive. I barely slept, my knife in my hand, my back against the rock. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no sounds, just the unbearable silence. First light, I was moving again. My legs ached. My body was exhausted, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the trailhead, I practically collapsed. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack inside and locked the doors before taking a breath. As I sat there, trying to process everything, I noticed something on my windshield. A single handprint, smudged, dirty, too big to be my own. I never went back to that forest again. I had planned the trip for months, a solo hike through a remote stretch of wilderness I'd read about in an old guidebook. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find in travel magazines or online lists. Just miles of dense forest, rocky trails, and deep valleys with few markers and no cell service. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect, to be alone with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of nature. I parked my car at the trailhead just before noon, stuffing my backpack with the essentials. Food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra clothes, and a small knife. My plan was simple: hike in about 10 miles, set up camp, and return the next day. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, and no sign of rain. I told myself it was going to be an easy, peaceful trip. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was rugged but manageable, weaving through thick patches of trees and steep inclines. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves rustled in the breeze, and occasionally, I'd hear the distant snap of a branch as some unseen animal moved through the woods. The air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine. It was exactly what I had been looking for, a break from the noise and demands of everyday life. I was about 5 miles in when I noticed the first odd thing: a rusted, bent tent pole sticking out of the ground just off the trail. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by some past hiker. A few feet away, half hidden under the leaves, was an old, rotting boot. I didn't think much of it at the time. People abandoned gear all the time. I kept walking. At around mile 8, the path began to narrow, pushing me into a more enclosed section of the forest. The trees here were thicker, the underbrush denser, and the air seemed oddly still. The deeper I went, the less noise there was. The cheerful chirping of birds had stopped, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The feeling was subtle at first, like a tickle at the back of my mind, but it grew stronger with every step. Something was off. At mile 10, I reached the spot where I planned to set up camp. It was a small clearing with just enough room for my tent and a small fire. As I unpacked, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There was already a fire pit here, and it wasn't old. The rocks were arranged in a neat circle, and the ashes in the center were fresh, darkened with the moisture of recent use. Someone had been here and not long ago. I stood still, listening. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no signs of life, just trees and silence. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of who might have been here. There were no tracks, no discarded food wrappers, nothing. A little unsettled but not wanting to overthink it, I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a fire. Night fell quickly, and the woods around me became an abyss of blackness. The fire was my only light, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I ate my dinner, listening for any sounds beyond the crackling flames. There was nothing. No wind, no distant rustling of nocturnal animals, just an unsettling silence that pressed in from all sides. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Took me a moment to register why. The fire was out, and everything was pitch black. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside my tent. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch. Slow, cautious steps circling. Someone or something was out there. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the dark. I clicked it on and pointed it at the tent wall. Shadows shifted as the beam illuminated the thin fabric. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Minutes passed. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was an animal and not a person, I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. Low, steady, just outside my tent. I held the knife in my shaking hand, ready for anything. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound disappeared. No footsteps, no retreating rustle of leaves, just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife and listening for any sign of movement. When the first light crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent and scanned the area. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate someone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I didn't waste time packing up. I shoved everything into my backpack and started the hike back at double my normal pace. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. The woods felt different in the daylight, less menacing but still eerily quiet. Around mile 5, I noticed something ahead on the trail, something that made my blood run cold. It was my own boot prints from the day before, but there was something else next to them. Another set of prints, barefoot, and they hadn't been there when I passed through the first time. They were fresh, following my path exactly. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, not stopping until I saw my car in the distance. I threw my gear into the back seat, locked the doors, and sped off without looking back. I never reported what happened. I told myself it was probably just a squatter, maybe a hunter, someone living off the grid. But deep down, I know someone had followed me. Someone had stood outside my tent in the middle of the night, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I never heard them leave. I had been planning the solo hike for weeks. It was something I had always wanted to do. disconnect from everything, challenge myself, and spend a few days in the wilderness with nothing but my gear and my instincts. I had chosen a lesser-known trail deep in the national forest, a place far from tourist paths and casual hikers. It was meant to be a place where solitude came naturally, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant calls of wildlife. The first day went smoothly. I had parked my car at the ranger station, checked the map one last time, and started my journey into the dense woods. The trail was rugged but manageable, weaving through towering trees and rocky outcroppings. I kept a steady pace, making sure to stay on course, and by late afternoon, I had found a good spot to set up camp. The air smelled fresh, a mixture of pine and damp earth, and as the sun dipped below the treetops, I felt a deep sense of peace. I ate my meal, enjoyed the quiet, and crawled into my tent early, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves as I drifted to sleep. The second day, I ventured further into the forest. The trail was even more isolated than I expected. I hadn't seen another person since I had set out, and while part of me enjoyed the solitude, another part couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It was subtle at first, just a sense that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear something behind me, a branch snapping, a rustling in the undergrowth. But each time I turned, there was nothing there, just the trees, unmoving and silent. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a creek running through it. I took off my pack and refilled my water bottles, splashing some cool water on my face. The forest was beautiful in a way that felt almost untouched by time, but I still couldn't shake that nagging feeling. As I sat on a fallen log, eating a quick snack, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, just absolute, heavy stillness. I stood up and scanned the area. Nothing, just trees and thick underbrush. But the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. I forced myself to push the thought aside, shouldered my pack, and pressed on. The further I walked, the worse it got. I kept hearing something in the distance, footsteps that stopped when I stopped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal, maybe just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I moved deeper into the forest, I started noticing signs that I wasn't alone. A pile of rocks stacked in a deliberate pattern. A tree with long, deep scratches along its bark. An old, rusted tin can hanging from a low branch, swaying gently as if it had just been touched. That night, I set up camp near a ridge. I made sure to pick a spot with clear visibility where I could see anyone or anything approaching. I built a fire, trying to push the unease away with its warmth and light. The night air was cool, and the fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the darkness. I ate in silence, my ears straining for any sound beyond the normal noises of the forest. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps on dry leaves, not heavy, not clumsy. Someone, something moving carefully, just beyond the glow of the fire. I sat perfectly still, my breath slow and shallow. My knife was in my pack, but I didn't dare reach for it. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, long and unbearable. I waited, staring into the darkness, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I retreated into my tent. I kept my knife close, lying on my back, listening. I don't know when I fell asleep, but at some point I did. I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside my tent. Not the wind, not an animal. Human breathing. Slow, steady. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The only thing between me and whoever was out there was the thin fabric of my tent. My mind raced through every possibility. A lost hiker? A ranger? No, whoever it was had been following me for hours. This wasn't an accident. Then the breathing stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, gripping my knife, staring at the roof of the tent. The first hint of dawn was creeping in when I finally dared to move. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers. The trees stood still, indifferent. But then I saw it just a few feet from my tent, in the dirt. Footprints, bare footprints, deep, deliberate, circling my campsite. I didn't waste another second. I packed my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I just started hiking back the way I came, moving fast, heart pounding. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every rustling leaf sent a jolt of panic through me. By midday, I reached a fork in the trail that I knew would lead me back to my car. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I kept moving, faster, pushing myself beyond exhaustion. And then, finally, I saw it, my car sitting untouched at the trailhead. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sped away without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I had planned the hike for weeks. The idea was to take a solo trip into a remote section of the national forest, away from the crowds and the well-worn trails. I wanted solitude, just me and the wilderness. I had always found comfort in the quiet of the woods, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on dirt, the distant call of birds overhead. But comfort was the last thing I would find on this trip. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning, having driven for hours into the mountains. There was no cell service this deep in, which I expected. I had prepared for that: map, compass, extra supplies. The weather was mild, the sky a crisp blue, and the trees swayed lazily in a light breeze. Felt perfect. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through thick pine and oak forests. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Birds still called, but there was a distinct lack of human noise. No distant voices, no airplane hum, nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. About 5 miles in, I veered off onto a smaller, unmarked path. I had found it on an old map and was curious to see where it led. It was overgrown but still passable, and according to my map, it should reconnect with the main trail further up. As I walked, I noticed an increasing sense of isolation. The forest grew denser, the trees towering and leaning in as if trying to swallow the path completely. Then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A single, worn-out boot was sitting just off the trail. It was old, the leather cracked and discolored, the laces missing. At first, I figured someone had lost it long ago. But then I spotted something else further ahead. A torn piece of fabric, dirty and faded, stuck to a low-hanging branch. The forest around me suddenly felt oppressive, like it had been waiting for me to notice these things before closing in. I pushed forward, trying to convince myself it was nothing. People lose things all the time, but my stomach churned with unease. About an hour later, I reached a small clearing. There was an old fire pit, the stones blackened and some scattered, as if someone had kicked them over in frustration. Nearby, a tree had deep gouges in the bark, not from an animal but something deliberate, something with force behind it. My gut told me to turn back, but I was stubborn. I had planned this hike. I wasn't going to let some abandoned campsite spook me. I set up camp about 100 yards away, close enough to the trail but far enough from the clearing to ease my nerves. As the sun dipped, the woods became eerily silent. Even the insects seemed to hush. I ate my dinner quickly and climbed into my tent, zipping it tight. Sleep came in uneasy waves. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something had snapped a branch outside. My body went rigid, ears straining. A few moments of silence passed, and then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps moving around my campsite. My breath hitched. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The steps continued, circling, pausing every so often as if whoever or whatever it was listening for movement. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps faded into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound sending a jolt through my spine. Morning brought some relief, but my nerves were shot. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. As I made my way back toward the main trail, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. My tracks from the previous day were still there, but now there was another set of footprints following them. Deep impressions, larger than my own, trailing me from where I had first left the marked path. Someone had been watching me. I moved fast, my heart pounding. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I just kept going. When I finally reached the trailhead, I half expected to see someone waiting for me, standing by my car, watching. But there was no one, just my vehicle untouched. I got inside, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I was far from those woods. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had walked around my tent at night? That I had felt watched? That wouldn't have been enough to justify anything. But I knew the truth. Someone else had been out there, moving through those trees, following me, and they had let me know it. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me a sense of control, a break from the usual noise, a way to clear my head. There was something about being alone in the woods, the quiet hum of nature, the crunch of dirt under my boots. I wasn't some extreme survivalist, just someone who enjoyed a long walk in the wilderness. So, when I planned a weekend hike deep in a national forest, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a couple of days in the woods, nothing more. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It wasn't completely abandoned, but it didn't have the crowds that some of the other spots had. That's what I liked about it. It was off the beaten path, but not too far off. I had done my research. The terrain was mostly steady, though there were a few steep inclines. There were no reports of aggressive wildlife, just the usual warnings about bears and snakes. Nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I packed light, enough food for a couple of days, water purification tablets, a tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a knife. I always carried a knife, even though I had never needed to use it for anything more than cutting rope or whittling sticks while I passed the time. I also had my phone, but I wasn't expecting much signal out there. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking to stay connected. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail was quiet, just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling in the brush. The air was crisp, the sun filtering through the trees. I made good time, stopping every so often to drink water and rest my legs. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the spot I had planned to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, perfect for refilling my water supply. I pitched my tent, set up my small camp stove, and ate a quick meal. Everything was going as planned. As the sun started to set, I felt the familiar sense of isolation settling in. It was the part one liked the most, being completely alone, away from everything. I sat outside my tent for a while, watching the sky darken. The forest was different at night. The sounds changed. The wind felt colder, but I wasn't afraid. I had done this before. Sometime after I climbed into my tent, I heard something, a branch snapping. Not unusual, not something that should have made me nervous. Animals move around at night. Still, I found myself holding my breath, listening carefully. A few seconds later, another sound, a rustling, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the tent wall. Nothing. The sound stopped. Probably just a raccoon, I told myself. I tried to ignore it, but I slept lightly, waking up at every little noise. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The next day, I planned to hike deeper into the forest before looping back toward my car. The hike started out fine, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the usual paranoia that comes with being in the woods by yourself. It was something more than that, a sense of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything, just trees. Still, I picked up my pace. A few hours in, I found something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt. Someone else had been through here and not long ago. I wasn't sure why it unsettled me so much. This was a public forest. Other people hiked here, but I hadn't seen anyone, not since I started. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I kept moving, The faster I got back to my car, the better. I cut my trip short. I didn't want to be out there another night. Something didn't feel right. I could handle the wilderness, but people were unpredictable. As I walked, I kept noticing little things that didn't sit well with me. A tree branch, freshly broken, hanging at an unnatural angle. A pile of rocks stacked neatly on the side of the trail. Something that wasn't there on my way in. And then the worst thing, my own boot prints. I had looped back to a section of the trail I had already passed through, but there was something wrong. Next to my prints, there was another set, following mine. I don't remember making a conscious decision to run, but I did. I ran as fast as I could, my pack bouncing against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop to check behind me. I didn't stop at all until I reached my car. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, my hands shaking against the wheel. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. But I knew someone had been out there. Someone had followed me. I never went back to that trail. I never went back to any trail alone. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, I wasn't going to take the chance of running into them again. I had planned the hike for weeks. The route was an isolated trail deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a long, winding path that cut through dense forests and climbed up steep ridges before descending into a valley where a small, rarely visited lake sat in near silence. I wanted solitude. I wanted the challenge of making the full loop, camping one night, and returning to my car by the next evening. I had checked the weather forecast. No storms, no rain, just crisp autumn air and the promise of golden leaves crunching under my boots. I packed carefully, enough food for 2 days, a tent, a sleeping bag, extra socks, a flashlight with spare batteries, a knife, a first aid kit. I knew the rules of solo hiking. Stay on the trail, be aware of your surroundings, and most importantly, trust your instincts. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest was alive with the sound of birds, the occasional rustling of small animals darting through fallen leaves, the steady rhythm of my boots against packed dirt. I enjoyed the way the trail twisted through the trees, climbing gradually before flattening out along a narrow ridge. From up there, I could see the valley below, the lake shimmering in the distance like a dark mirror. I made good time. By mid-afternoon, I was already descending into the valley, the air growing cooler as the trees thickened. The trail was more rugged here, with uneven footing and large rocks that jutted up like the exposed bones of the earth. I kept my pace steady, careful with my footing, knowing that a twisted ankle out here could turn a simple hike into a dangerous situation. The first sign that something felt off was subtle. I noticed the absence of sound. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died down. Even the distant hum of insects seemed to have faded. It was the kind of silence that made your own breathing sound too loud, your own footsteps echo strangely in your ears. I glanced around, scanning the trees for movement, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the same dense woods, the same narrow trail, the same dying light filtering through the canopy. I shook it off and kept walking. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was sinking low. The water was still, untouched by wind, its surface smooth and black. I set up my tent a few yards from the shore, using a small clearing that looked well-worn from previous campers. The solitude was nice at first. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and watched the sky darken, the trees turning to silhouettes against the fading orange glow. I planned to get some rest and start early in the morning, making the long trek back before the afternoon heat set in. Then, as I was securing my food in a bag to hang from a tree, I saw something that stopped me cold. There were footprints near my tent. Not my own. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth, leading from the trees to my camp and back again. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. I hadn't heard anyone. The idea that someone had been near my camp without making a sound sent a wave of unease through me. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the darkness between the trees, listening. But there was nothing. I told myself it was fine. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier. Maybe I had just missed them. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to keep my knife close and sleep lightly. The night was long. Every tiny sound seemed amplified. The creaking branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustling of leaves. I drifted in and out of sleep, my body tense, my senses on high alert. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a sound just outside my tent. A slow, deliberate movement. Footsteps, not an animal. Too heavy, too careful. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the handle of my knife. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, waiting, listening. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, gripping my knife, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting for the first hint of dawn. When the sky finally lightened, I unzipped the tent slowly, my muscles tense, ready for anything. There was nothing there, but the footprints were fresh, circling my tent. I didn't waste time packing up. I grabbed my gear, slung my bag over my shoulder, and started back up the trail, moving fast. Too fast. I stumbled a few times but forced myself forward, my only goal being to get out of that valley and back onto the ridge where I could see everything around me. The whole way up, I felt it. That same silence, that same absence of life, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following, but there was never anything there. When I finally reached the ridge, I didn't stop. I forced myself to keep going, my legs burning, my lungs aching, until I saw the small dirt parking lot where my car was waiting. I half ran the last stretch, threw my pack in the back seat, and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know that I wasn't alone. And that was the last time I ever hiked that trail alone. Hiking alone was something I had done for years. It gave me a sense of control, a break from the constant noise of everyday life. The woods were a place where I could clear my head, push my body, and experience something that felt almost primal. But one trip changed that forever. It changed the way I saw the wilderness, the way I felt when I was alone, and the way I trusted my own instincts. It was supposed to be a straightforward 3-day hike. I had picked a remote trail in a national forest, a place known for its untouched beauty and deep woods, the kind of place where you wouldn't run into another person for miles. That was part of the appeal. I had packed enough food, water, and supplies to last me more than the planned time, just in case. My backpack was heavy, but I had hiked with heavier. The first day was uneventful. The trail was rugged but manageable. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to swallow the sound around me. The only noise was my own breathing, the crunch of my boots on the dirt, and the occasional rustling of wildlife. It was peaceful. By late afternoon, I had reached a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream. I pitched my tent, set up my little camp stove, and ate as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped quickly, and soon I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up once or twice when camping, just from the unfamiliar sounds. But this felt different. I held my breath, listening. There was nothing at first, just silence, and then a sound, faint, almost too soft to hear. Footsteps. I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. A bear was always a possibility, but I had kept my food sealed away and far from my tent. My hand moved slowly to my knife, just in case. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, not the unpredictable movements of an animal. Something was walking near my camp. I stayed still, waiting. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move for a long time, just listening, my heart pounding. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. In the morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of anything unusual. No footprints that I could see, no disturbed foliage. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe it was just an animal after all. Either way, I shook it off and packed up my gear. I had a long hike ahead of me. The second day was harder. The trail got steeper, the air thicker. The deeper I went, the less it felt like a place meant for people. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisting and gnarled. The forest was dense enough that even in the middle of the day, it felt dim. Every now and then, I would hear something in the distance. Branches snapping, the distant call of a bird, but I never saw anything. By late afternoon, I reached another clearing and set up camp again. The uneasiness from the night before had mostly faded. I was just tired. After eating, I climbed into my tent and closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion pull me under. I woke up again that night. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The footsteps were back, closer. I lay there, knife in hand, waiting. The sound moved around the edge of my camp, slow, careful, not rushing, not an animal. It was circling me. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever or whatever was out there might hear it. And then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, gripping my knife, barely breathing. But eventually, morning came. When I finally stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Human. Not mine. They circled my camp, stopping just feet from my tent before leading back into the woods. Panic surged through me. Someone had been watching me. They had walked around my camp, standing just outside my tent while I slept. My mind raced. Had they been here the night before too? Was this the first time? I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, glancing around every few seconds, expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. But there was no one. I started back the way I came, moving fast, too fast. My heart was still hammering. The idea of spending another night out here was out of the question. The hike back was brutal. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. Every time I heard a sound, I spun around, expecting to see someone following me. I never did, but I felt it. The whole way back, I felt it. I reached my car just before sunset, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I didn't stop. I threw my gear into the back seat, locked the doors, and drove until I was back in civilization. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had walked around my tent? That I had felt like I was being followed? No crime had been committed, no evidence left behind. But I never hiked alone again, because whoever was out there that night, they weren't lost. They weren't a fellow hiker. They had been waiting, watching, and I had no doubt in my mind that if I had stayed another night, I wouldn't have made it out. I never thought much about solo hiking. It wasn't something I actively sought out, but it wasn't something I feared either. I liked the quiet, the peace of being alone in the woods with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. It was supposed to be a simple, straightforward trip, just a few days out in the mountains, away from everything. The trail was well documented, frequently traveled, and, from what I read, relatively easy to navigate. I planned accordingly. I packed enough food, water, and supplies to last me longer than I needed. I carried a map, a compass, and a GPS. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The first day went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air with a bright sun overhead. The path was easy to follow, winding through thick trees, their branches reaching over the trail like a tunnel. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. I walked for hours, my boots crunching against the dirt, the occasional chirping of birds breaking the silence. I passed a few hikers heading back down, exchanging brief nods and small smiles. I set up camp before sundown, cooked a simple meal, and sat in silence, enjoying the calm. It was the last peaceful moment of my trip. The second day, things started to feel off. I woke up early, as planned, packed up my camp, and continued along the trail. The deeper I went, the fewer people I saw. That wasn't unusual. Most people stuck to the lower parts of the trail, but something about the quiet didn't sit right. It was too quiet. No birds, No rustling leaves, just my own footsteps echoing through the trees. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, embedded in the dirt, heading in the same direction I was going. That wasn't the strange part. The strange part was how erratic they looked, like whoever made them had been moving fast, too fast. Some of them were deep, pressed hard into the ground as if they had been running. Others were barely there, the edges of the prints uneven, like they had stumbled. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had been in a hurry. Maybe they were trying to beat the sunset. But a feeling settled deep in my gut, something I couldn't shake. I kept walking. Hours passed. The sky grew overcast. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above me. I kept moving, checking my GPS every so often to make sure I was on track. That's when I saw it. Something hanging from a tree up ahead. At first, I thought it was just some trash, maybe a lost piece of clothing. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was a backpack, torn, shredded along the sides, hanging from a low branch by one of its straps. It hadn't been there long. The fabric was still clean, not yet faded from the weather. I walked closer, hesitating before reaching out and touching it. The strap was frayed, almost like it had been cut. I looked around, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. No sign of anyone, just trees and endless silence. I should have turned around then. I should have walked back the way I came. But I didn't. I told myself I'd find whoever it belonged to. Maybe they had dropped it, maybe they were hurt. I took a deep breath and kept going. The footprints were still there, still fresh, leading forward. Then they stopped, dead in the middle of the trail. No sign of turning, no sign of stepping off into the woods. Just gone, like whoever had been making them had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I scanned the trees, looking for anything, anyone. Nothing, just the wind, pushing through the branches, making them creak and sway. I took a step forward. A sound came from somewhere ahead, faint, almost like breathing. I froze, held my own breath, listened. Nothing. I turned and walked back the way I came, fast. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise, but I moved as quickly as I could without breaking into a sprint. My GPS still worked. I followed it. I forced myself not to look back. The sky was getting darker. The wind was picking up. I walked faster. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Behind me. Close. I turned around so fast I almost tripped. Nothing. Just trees. Just silence. I swallowed hard, my chest tight, my hands shaking. I kept moving. The sound followed me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I walked, it started again. I didn't hesitate anymore. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs. My lungs burned. My heart pounded. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get out. My GPS beeped in my pocket, warning me I was off course. I didn't care. I just ran. Then, ahead of me, I saw it, movement. Something darting between the trees. I didn't think. I didn't wait. I changed direction and sprinted the other way. My body screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. I kept going until my legs gave out, collapsing against the base of a tree, gasping for air. I sat there, shaking, waiting, listening. Nothing. I checked my GPS again. I wasn't far from the trailhead. Maybe an hour if I moved fast. I didn't stop again. I forced myself forward, one step after another, ignoring the burning in my muscles, the pain in my chest. When I finally saw my car, parked just where I left it, I almost cried. I didn't waste time. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking when I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I looked back one last time. At the edge of the tree line, something moved. Something tall. Something still. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove. I haven't been hiking since. I should have checked the weather again. I should have trusted my gut when the wind shifted. when the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled my nose before I even stepped onto the trail. But I didn't. I had planned this hike for weeks, and I wasn't going to back out now. It was an isolated trail, deep in the mountains, far from the usual weekend traffic. The kind of place where you could walk for miles without seeing another person. That was the appeal. Solitude, silence, a break from the world. I packed my gear carefully. Plenty of water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra socks, a knife, and enough food to last me overnight if needed. My phone had no signal, but I had an old-school map and compass just in case. The first few miles were perfect. The trail was damp from recent rain, but not enough to be dangerous. The air was crisp, and the canopy of trees kept the sun from beating down too hard. I made good time, covering ground faster than expected. It was peaceful, just the sound of my boots against the dirt and the occasional rustling in the bushes. Birds, probably, maybe a squirrel. Nothing to worry about. But then, something changed. Around the 5-mile mark, the forest went silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I stopped, listening, waiting for the usual sounds to return. They didn't. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. I swallowed hard and kept moving, convincing myself it was nothing. Sometimes forests got quiet. It didn't mean anything. Another mile in, I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading off the trail into the underbrush. Bare feet. I stopped and stared, my brain refusing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who the hell hikes barefoot this deep in the woods? They were deep impressions, meaning whoever left them was heavy, and they weren't scattered like someone walking casually. They were deliberate, purposeful, as if whoever made them had been standing in one place, waiting. A feeling crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe some hunter had been out here or a survivalist testing themselves. People did weird things. I moved on, faster now, telling myself I was being paranoid. The further I went, the worse I felt. The silence stayed. The air got thicker. I was sweating now, despite the cool air, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around. I ignored it. Then I saw it. Pile of bones, picked clean. Not animal bones. Too big. Human. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. The bones were scattered, some half buried in the dirt, others stacked in a neat little pile. I forced myself to breathe, to think. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. My first thought was to call someone, but my phone was useless out here. My next thought was to turn around and get the hell out. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to my belt. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But something was out there, watching. I could feel it. I walked fast, almost jogging, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept my eyes on the trail, refusing to look back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. Mistakes meant I might not make it out. The footprints appeared again, this time on the trail. Not mine. Someone else's, following my path, appearing where they hadn't been before. I stopped cold. My breathing was too loud. The silence pressed in. I forced myself to move, to keep going, my hands clenched into fists. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the forest noise returned. Birds chirped, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the pressure in my chest lifted. It was like stepping out of a nightmare and back into reality. I didn't stop until I was back at my car. I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I never reported what I found. Who would believe me? The bones, the footprints, the awful silence? They call me paranoid, say I imagined it. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. All I know is I'm never hiking alone again. I started early, just after sunrise, when the air was still crisp and the world was quiet. The trail I had chosen ran deep into the mountains, cutting through dense forests and rocky outcrops. It was one of those remote places where you wouldn't see another person for miles. That's what I wanted: solitude, a break from the noise of everyday life. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest felt alive but not threatening. Birds called from the treetops, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, just surrounded by creatures that belonged. The ground beneath my boots was damp from the night's moisture, and the earthy smell of moss and pine filled the air. As the morning stretched on, I found myself deeper into the trail, the trees growing denser, their canopy thick enough to block out most of the sun. It was quieter here. Even the birds seemed to have moved elsewhere. I told myself it was normal, that nature had its own rhythm, but something about the silence made my skin prickle. I kept moving, shaking off the unease. A few hours in, I reached a narrow ridge that overlooked the valley below. The view was stunning, the kind that makes you pause and take a deep breath, letting the vastness of it all settle in. I took a short break there, sipping water and letting my legs rest. There were no signs of other hikers, just me, the mountains, and the wind whistling through the trees. That was when I noticed something strange. The ridge had a small clearing, just large enough for a few people to sit comfortably, but it wasn't empty. A few feet away, near the edge, were deep scratches in the dirt, like someone had been clawing at the ground. Not just random marks either, deliberate deep grooves. I frowned, kneeling down for a closer look. They didn't seem fresh, but they weren't old either. A few days, maybe a week. A bear? That was my first thought. But bears dig. They don't scratch like this. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. I felt a small chill creep up my spine but pushed it aside. There was no sign of an animal nearby, and I hadn't seen any tracks on the way up. Still, I didn't linger. I shouldered my pack and continued down the trail. The further I went, the more unsettling things became. I started noticing small details, little things that felt out of place. A pile of rocks stacked neatly on the side of the trail, unnatural in its arrangement. Broken branches hanging from trees at odd angles. A piece of fabric, torn and weathered, caught on a bush. Each thing alone meant nothing, but together, they set my nerves on edge. I kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just unease, that prickling awareness that you're being watched even when no one is there. About 5 miles in, the trail took a steep descent into a ravine. The trees were thicker here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots jutting out from the ground like grasping fingers. The light barely reached the forest floor. The air was damp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. I took each step carefully, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Then I saw it. A boot print, clear, deep, and unmistakable. I stopped immediately, my pulse hammering in my ears. The print was fresh, no more than a few hours old. But that wasn't what made my stomach tighten. It was the direction. The print faced uphill toward me, but there was no sign of a return print. Someone had come this way but never went back. I turned, scanning the trees, my breath coming quicker now. I told myself it was fine, that there were other hikers out here, that I just hadn't seen them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The trail was remote. I had checked the logs at the ranger station before starting out. No one else had signed in for this route today. I was alone, or at least I should have been. The rational part of my brain told me to keep going, to stick to the plan. But my gut screamed at me to turn back. I hesitated for a long moment, then forced myself forward. The best option was to finish the loop. Turning back would add miles to my trip, and I didn't want to be caught out here after dark. I moved faster now, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my heart jump. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling grew, like I was walking into something I shouldn't be seeing. Then I found the second boot print. This one was different. It was smeared, as if whoever left it had slipped or been dragged. The dirt was disturbed, scuffed in a way that made my throat go dry. My hands tightened around the straps of my pack. I had to get out of here. Now, I turned sharply, retracing my steps, pushing my pace without outright running. I needed to get back to higher ground, back to where I had cell service. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining for any sound that wasn't mine. Then I heard it, a rustling, too steady to be the wind. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to get away. The sound followed, steady, deliberate. Footsteps. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping against my arms, my legs burning with the effort. My pack felt like dead weight, but I didn't stop. I just kept moving, pushing forward, lungs screaming for air. Finally, the trees thinned. I could see the ridge ahead, the spot where I had stopped earlier. The moment I hit open ground, I turned, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Nothing, just the trees standing silent and still. I didn't wait. I ran the rest of the way back, my body running on pure adrenaline. It wasn't until I was back at my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, that I finally let myself breathe. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I won't be going back. I don't think I'll ever go hiking alone again. Started as a simple day trip, nothing crazy. I planned to hike a 10-mile loop through the mountains, something I'd done before. I had my gear, plenty of water, some protein bars, a knife, a first aid kit, and my phone fully charged. The forecast was clear, the trail was well marked, and I had no reason to think anything would go wrong. The first few miles were peaceful. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt path, the rustling of trees, and the occasional chirp of birds. The air was cool but comfortable, and I felt strong, moving steadily uphill. The trees were thick, but the trail was easy to follow. I passed a few hikers heading back toward the trailhead, exchanging polite nods. Around the 5-mile mark, I stopped for a break on a flat stretch of the trail. I drank some water, ate half a protein bar, and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising. I'd lose reception in these mountains before, but it always came back after a while. I shrugged it off and continued walking. Then, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest had changed. The birds were gone. The wind still moved through the trees, but it felt different, almost unnatural. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing, just silence. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the birds had just moved on. I pressed forward. A few minutes later, I saw something on the trail ahead. A backpack just sitting there, abandoned. It was an older model, faded and worn. I stopped and looked around. No sign of anyone. I walked closer and crouched beside it. It looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was stiff, and there were leaves stuck to it. I hesitated, then unzipped the main compartment. Inside, there were a few crumpled snack wrappers, a map, and a water bottle completely empty. Something felt wrong. I had been hiking this trail for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone heading in this direction. If someone had left it recently, I should have seen them. I stood up and looked around again. The trees were still, the silence thick. I suddenly felt exposed, like I was being watched. I kept moving. The feeling didn't go away. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. The trail felt narrower now, the trees pressing in. My own breathing sounded too loud. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I saw it. A few yards off the trail, something was hanging from a low tree branch, a jacket torn and faded. I stepped closer. It looked like it had been there for a long time, the fabric stiff and discolored. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. Something about it felt wrong. I turned back to the trail and started walking faster. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't see who or what was making them. But they were there. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, heart pounding. Nothing. Just the empty trail, stretching behind me. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after a few seconds, I turned back and started walking again. The moment I moved, the footsteps started again. I broke into a jog. The sound of my boots on the dirt filled my ears, and the faster I went, the louder those other footsteps seemed to get. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to see whatever was there. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing where the sun broke through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I forced myself to keep going. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming now. Then, ahead on the trail, I saw something that stopped me cold. Another backpack. It was just like the first one. Old, abandoned, sitting in the middle of the trail. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Had I gone in a circle? No, that wasn't possible. I'd been moving in a straight line. I checked my phone again. Still no service. Something was very, very wrong. I forced myself to keep moving, keeping my pace steady. I needed to get out of there. I needed to get back to the trailhead. The footsteps never stopped. They stayed just out of sight, just behind me. Never closer, never farther. Then I saw something up ahead. A signpost. Relief flooded me for half a second, until I got close enough to read it. It was weathered, the words faded, but I could still make them out. Missing hiker notice. The name was unfamiliar. The date, however, made my stomach drop. 2 weeks ago. I looked around again, feeling like I was standing in the middle of something I didn't understand. The forest was still silent, the trees unmoving. Then, for the first time, I smelled something. Rot. Something decaying. The wind shifted, and the smell hit me stronger. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my body screaming in protest. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I ran until the trees thinned, until the parking lot was in sight. I stumbled to my car, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. The silence in my car felt unnatural, like I had stepped into another world. I sat there for a long time trying to calm my breathing. Finally, I turned the engine on and drove away, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more times than I could count. When I got home, I checked the name from the sign online. The hiker had never been found. And the worst part? The description of his gear matched the backpacks I had seen. I don't go hiking alone anymore. The morning started like any other. Cool. Crisp air filled my lungs as I zipped up my jacket and adjusted the straps of my backpack. The plan was simple. Hike a remote trail in the mountains, enjoy the solitude, and return before nightfall. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, but something about this particular trip felt different. Maybe it was the way the fog clung to the valley below or the unsettling silence that filled the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of the trees. Still, I brushed it off and pressed forward. The trail was rough, less maintained than I expected. The dirt path was narrow, and roots jutted out like hidden traps waiting to trip me up. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I had chosen this route specifically for that reason. Fewer people, less noise, just me and nature. I found peace in the quiet, but after about an hour, the silence started to feel oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, no distant sound of flowing water, just my own footsteps crunching against the earth. I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued ahead, well-trodden and marked by occasional trail signs. To my right was another path, narrower and clearly less used. The map on my phone didn't show it, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped onto the smaller trail, convinced it would lead to a more scenic view. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The path became more uneven, strewn with rocks and fallen branches. At one point, I nearly lost my footing on a patch of loose dirt. Still, I pushed on. Then I noticed it, the first sign that something was off. A rusted metal canteen, partially buried in the dirt, its surface weathered by time. I bent down, brushing away the dirt. The design looked old, like something from decades ago. Nearby, I saw a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Its once vibrant color faded to a dull brown. It wasn't recent, but who had left it? I stood up, scanning my surroundings. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints other than my own. My gut told me to turn back, but my pride kept me moving forward. Maybe I'd find a campsite, an abandoned shelter, something to explain the forgotten items. Minutes turned to hours. The path twisted and turned, becoming steeper, more treacherous. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising, given the remote location, but the realization left a heavy feeling in my chest. I wasn't lost, not yet, but I was further from the main trail than I had intended. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that grew stronger with every step. It smelled like decay, like something rotting. I covered my nose and pressed on, heart pounding. And then I saw it, a small clearing ahead, partially obscured by thick underbrush. A structure stood there, barely visible through the dense foliage. A cabin? No, something smaller, more makeshift. As I moved closer, I saw that it was an old, weather-beaten tent, half collapsed and covered in leaves. I hesitated before stepping closer. The fabric was torn, shredded in places. The stench was overwhelming now. I steeled myself and peered inside. The sight made my stomach drop. Pile of bones. Animal bones, I told myself. Had to be, but they were scattered haphazardly. Some snapped in half as if broken by force. Among the bones were tattered pieces of clothing, a single shoe with its laces undone. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, scanning the area. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I turned back the way I came, walking faster, then breaking into a jog. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get back to the main trail. Then I heard it, a crunch of leaves. Not mine. I stopped, ears straining. Silence. My mind raced. An animal? The wind? My own paranoia? I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. But every few steps, I heard it again, soft, deliberate footfalls. I wasn't alone. Panic took hold, and I broke into a full sprint. The narrow trail was unforgiving. Branches slashed at my arms. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I had to get out. Then, up ahead, I saw it. Something that made my blood run cold. A second trail. One I hadn't seen before. It veered off to the right, almost identical to the one I had taken earlier. My mind reeled. Had I been going in circles? Was this a different path entirely? I had no time to think. I picked a direction and ran. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop until I burst onto the main trail. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The familiar signs of the marked path were a welcome sight. I looked back. Nothing moved. No sound. Just the quiet forest staring back at me. I didn't waste time. I hiked back as fast as I could, not daring to stop, not daring to look back again. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there, hands shaking. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I won't ever hike alone again. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the quiet, about the way the world seemed to fold into itself in the deep woods, that felt right to me. I didn't need anyone else, just my boots, my pack, and miles of trail ahead. That's why I didn't hesitate when I found a lesser-known trail in the mountains a few hours from home. It wasn't marked on most maps, just a mention in an old forum post about forgotten paths, a place not many people went. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up was uneventful, just a long stretch of winding roads and occasional glimpses of the mountains in the distance. The air smelled fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked at a small pull-off where the trailhead was supposed to be. There was no official sign, just a break in the trees and a faint path leading into the woods. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow, but well-defined, weaving through thick clusters of trees. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I checked my map app a few times, but the GPS barely worked out here. That was fine. I had an old-school compass and a printed map as a backup. I wasn't worried. As I hiked deeper, the trail became less distinct. At times, I had to push through overgrown brush, my arms scratched by thorns and low branches. It felt like no one had been here in years. That was part of the thrill, though, walking where few others had, finding something untouched. Around midday, I stopped for a break near a small clearing. The air was still, too still. No birds, no wind, just silence. That should have been my first warning, but I chalked it up to the time of day and kept moving. The terrain grew rougher, the path less clear. I had to check my compass more often, making small adjustments to stay on course. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me didn't look right. The trees all seemed too similar, their trunks lined up in eerie symmetry. I stopped and looked around, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Patterns where there were none. I pushed on. The sky darkened faster than I expected, and I realized I had lost more time than I thought. My pace quickened. I wasn't in real trouble yet, but I needed to find a good spot to set up camp. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints in the dirt ahead of me. They weren't mine. The tread was different, the spacing longer. Someone else had been here recently. But how recently? And why had I seen no sign of them before now? I told myself it was fine. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier in the day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I found a relatively flat patch of ground and set up my tent quickly. The sense of unease clung to me, but I forced myself to eat, to go through my usual routine. I didn't want to let fear take over. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent felt amplified. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just animals, but deep down, I wasn't sure. When morning came, I packed up quickly, eager to move. But as I turned back toward the trail, my stomach dropped. My footprints from the day before were still there, but they weren't alone. There were new ones. Someone had walked up to my campsite while I slept. I felt a chill run through me. Whoever it was, they hadn't made themselves known. They hadn't spoken, hadn't woken me up, just watched. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I had my knife, a small hatchet. I wasn't defenseless, but I needed to get out of there. I picked up my pace, moving faster than I normally would. Every so often, I glanced back, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. The trail was harder to follow on the way back. I must have veered slightly off course in my rush, because the trees seemed denser, the landscape unfamiliar. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I forced myself to stop and get my bearings. Then I saw it. A small structure half hidden by the trees. A cabin, maybe? I hadn't seen it on the way in. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. Something about it made my skin crawl. I should have turned around right then, but something pulled me forward. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. As I stepped closer, I noticed the footprints again, leading right to the open door. My breath caught in my throat. I don't know what made me look inside. Some part of me needed to know. The room was small, empty except for a wooden chair in the center. And on the chair, a single item, my hatchet. I had packed it that morning. I ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care if I was going the right way. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I saw my car through the trees. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of there without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again. I remember the day clearly. It was late September. The air had just started to turn crisp, and the leaves were beginning to shift into deep shades of orange and red. I had planned this solo hiking trip for weeks, a 2-day trek through a remote section of national forest, far away from the usual trails packed with tourists. The idea was to challenge myself, to push past my comfort zone and get a true sense of isolation in the wilderness. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and took a deep breath. The trail started off gentle, winding through tall pines that swayed in the light breeze. The sound of my boots crunching against the dirt mixed with the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. felt peaceful at first, almost meditative. But as I moved deeper into the forest, that sense of tranquility began to shift into something else. Something subtle but unsettling. It started with small things. The way the wind would pick up suddenly, rustling the trees harder than it should have. The way the birds seemed to fall silent whenever I stopped to rest. The way I kept feeling like something was just out of sight behind me, only to turn around and find nothing there. By the time I reached the first clearing, a wide open space with a small stream cutting through it, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination. I forced myself to shake off the unease and focus on the beauty around me. The water was crystal clear, the sky an unbroken stretch of blue. I refilled my bottle, checked my map, and continued on. The next few miles were more demanding. The trail climbed steeply, winding through thick brush and over loose, uneven rocks. Sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air, and my legs burned from the effort. Eventually, I reached a ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but there was no signal. I expected that, of course. I was miles away from civilization. I set up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. The ground was relatively flat, and there was a good spot to hang my food away from animals. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped quickly. I built a small fire, ate a simple meal, and let exhaustion pull me into my sleeping bag early. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. I listened, holding my breath. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows across the tent walls. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. An animal, maybe? A deer? But something about the rhythm of the steps didn't feel right. They weren't the random, cautious movements of a wild animal. They were steady, purposeful. I lay still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long silence, I heard another sound. A low, almost imperceptible exhale, like someone trying to breathe quietly. My stomach twisted. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I was miles away from the nearest marked trail, deep in the wilderness. I reached for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag and waited. Minutes passed. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, playing tricks on me. Just as I started to convince myself of that, something brushed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just a faint pressure, like a hand pressing against the fabric. I bolted upright, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles ached. My mind screamed at me to do something, yell, run, anything, but my body refused to move. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence outside my tent was gone. No footsteps retreating, no sound of movement, just silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed still, listening, heart hammering. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I unzipped my tent as slowly as I could, peering out. Nothing. The ground around my campsite was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I told myself I had imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching me. I packed up quickly and decided to cut my trip short. I'd planned to hike another day, but I wanted to be back to my car before nightfall. The hike back was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I moved fast, barely stopping to rest. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, but I never did. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I threw my pack inside and locked the doors the second I got in. As I turned the ignition, I glanced at the tree line one last time. Nothing, just the empty woods. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. It sounded crazy, even to me, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt, and I know, without a doubt, that I was not alone in those woods that night. I had been planning this hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the mountains, away from the crowds, exactly the kind of place I liked. Solitude, fresh air, and the sound of nature. It was supposed to be an overnight trip. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, extra layers, knife, emergency whistle, and a first aid kit. Everything I needed for a solo hike. I checked the weather multiple times. No rain in the forecast, just clear skies and cool air. Perfect. I parked my truck at the trailhead, locked up, and set out. The trail was well marked at first, cutting through dense pine forests. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt path. Birds chirped, and I could hear the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Peaceful. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed. The markers became less frequent. I had a map and compass, but I also had my phone with a GPS app. Service was spotty, but I wasn't worried. I had hiked alone dozens of times before. After about 4 hours, I reached a small clearing and decided to take a break. I dropped my pack, drank some water, and ate a granola bar. The silence was heavier here. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of a tree shifting. It was strange, but I brushed it off. The sun was still high, so I pushed forward. An hour later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I pulled out my map. According to it, I should have reached a stream by now. But there was no water, just endless trees. I checked my phone. No service. I wasn't lost. I knew the general direction I had come from. I could always backtrack. Still, something felt off. I kept walking, hoping to find a familiar landmark. The woods were getting thicker, the undergrowth denser. Branches snagged at my sleeves. My breathing was heavier, not from exertion, but from unease. I wasn't sure when exactly it happened, but I had stopped hearing any wildlife. No birds, no rustling, just silence. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A boot print in the dirt. Not mine. Someone else had been here. Recently. I wasn't scared yet, just on edge. It was a public trail after all. Others could be hiking nearby, maybe even ahead of me. But the problem was that the print was facing the opposite direction, like someone had been walking toward me. And I hadn't seen anyone all day. I decided to turn back. I wasn't far from my last known location, maybe an hour at most. I'd find the trail, set up camp nearby, and head back in the morning. I walked faster, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Then I saw the boot print again, the exact same one. I stopped, my breath hitching. I must have walked in a circle. But how? I had been careful. My steps were deliberate. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun slightly before settling. I had been walking in the right direction. So why was I back here? A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I told myself to stay calm. Panic was dangerous. I took a deep breath and changed course, moving at an angle instead of straight back. The terrain got rougher. Fallen logs, thick brush, uneven ground. I pushed forward, focusing on my breathing. Then I heard it. A branch snapped behind me. Close. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs. I turned my head slightly, listening. Nothing. Just that thick, heavy silence. I started walking again, forcing myself not to look back. Snap. Closer this time. I wasn't alone. I reached for the knife strapped to my belt. My fingers gripped the handle, slick with sweat. I walked faster, almost jogging now. The sound of footsteps followed. I broke into a full sprint. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just needed to get out of there. My pack bounced against my back. My boots pounded the ground. My lungs burned. Then the ground disappeared beneath me. I fell. I tumbled down a steep slope, hitting rocks and roots, my body rolling uncontrollably. My backpack caught on something, jerking me to a stop. Pain shot through my shoulder. I gasped, trying to focus. I was in a ravine. The walls were steep. No easy way back up. My ankle throbbed. I tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Twisted, maybe broken. I bit down on a curse and looked around. Something was watching me. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A shadow shifted at the edge of the ravine. I held my breath. A figure stood at the top, just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My ankle wouldn't hold. I reached for my whistle and blew it as hard as I could. The sharp sound pierced the air, echoing through the trees. The figure didn't react. I blew it again. Still nothing. Then they stepped back and disappeared into the trees. I sat there, shaking. My mind raced. Who the hell was that? Were they following me? Hunting me? I forced myself to move, crawling toward a fallen tree for cover. I needed a plan. Couldn't climb out. My ankle was useless. I had to wait until morning, at least until I could see better. I didn't sleep. Every sound made my pulse jump. The rustling of leaves, the creak of branches. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the pale light of dawn. The forest looked different in the morning, less menacing. I forced myself to stand, using a branch as a crutch. I had to move. It took me half the day to find a way out. My ankle screamed with every step, but I kept going. Eventually, I heard the distant sound of running water. The stream. If I followed it, I'd find my way back. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief flooded me. Not long after, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved it down, barely able to stand. The driver, an older man, looked at me with wide eyes. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He helped me into his truck and drove me back to my vehicle. I never found out who or what was in those woods with me, but I never hiked alone again. I checked the time on my watch, 3:17 p.m. The trail ahead twisted through a thick forest, the kind that felt older than anything else around it. I was deep into this solo hike, a full-day trek I had planned for weeks. It was supposed to be a challenge, something to clear my mind. No distractions, just me and the trail. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that made the trees seem darker than they really were. I had about 4 more miles to go before I reached my car. I figured I had plenty of time before the sun started dipping below the trees, but I quickened my pace anyway. Something about the air felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was my own footsteps crunching against the dirt and leaves. I had been on plenty of hikes before, but this time, something felt off. Maybe it was the lack of birdsong or the way the wind had completely stopped. The woods had a strange stillness, like the earth was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off and kept moving. After another half mile, I came to a fork in the trail. I pulled out my map, but the paper was damp from sweat and humidity, making it hard to read. I knew I had to take the left path to stay on course. But standing there, I noticed something strange. There were no signs or markers. Every other fork had them. I checked my phone for GPS, but of course I had no signal. I stood there for a minute, debating. The left path seemed more worn, but something about it made my stomach knot up. The right path, though overgrown, seemed to slope gently downward, which I knew wasn't the direction I needed to go. I took a deep breath and went left. I walked for another 20 minutes before I realized something was wrong. The trail was narrowing, the trees were getting closer together, and the ground was uneven. I hadn't seen any blazes or signs in a while. I stopped, looking around. The feeling in my gut had grown stronger. Then I saw it, a boot print in the dirt ahead. It wasn't mine. Someone else had come this way recently, but that wasn't what unsettled me. The print was deep, like whoever made it had been running. My chest tightened. I looked around again, suddenly feeling exposed. I decided to backtrack. I wasn't about to get lost in the woods when I had a clear choice to turn around. As I moved, I kept checking over my shoulder. The silence was oppressive, like the forest itself was watching me. Then I heard it, a crunch. It wasn't mine. I froze. Another crunch, closer this time. Someone or something was on the trail behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see, but I forced myself. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty, but the feeling that I wasn't alone had grown stronger, digging into my skin like needles. I started walking faster. My breathing was loud in my ears, my heart pounding. Then I saw another footprint, and another. They were fresh. Whoever was making them was ahead of me now. I stopped and listened, but the woods had swallowed every sound again. I had to get out. I turned, ready to move fast. And that's when I saw it, a makeshift camp just off the trail. A small, weathered tent, partially collapsed. A pile of ashes from a fire long burned out. An old, rusted canteen. It looked abandoned, but not for long. A piece of clothing, maybe a jacket, hung from a low branch like someone had left in a hurry. I didn't know why, but dread settled deep in my bones. I didn't want to be near that tent. I didn't want to know who had been there. I turned to leave when I noticed something else. Deep scratches on the tree near the tent. They weren't random. They were deliberate. Long, deep gashes, as if something sharp had carved into the bark. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. I didn't care if I had to bushwhack my way through the forest. I just needed to get out of there. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. My brain screamed at me to move faster, as if something unseen was right behind me. The feeling of being followed was unbearable. Then, up ahead, I saw it, another fork in the trail. But this one was familiar. Relief crashed over me. I recognized the marker. I was back on track. I didn't stop running until I could see the lot where my car was parked. My hands fumbled as I unlocked the door, jumping inside and locking it behind me. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. As I sat there, staring at the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe I had let my imagination get the best of me. But as I put my car in drive and pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the woods in my rearview mirror. And I swear, for just a second, I saw movement in the trees. I don't know why I felt the need to do this alone. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could. Whatever the reason, I packed up my gear, filled my water bottles, and set out on what was supposed to be a simple 3-day solo hike through a remote section of the mountains. I had done plenty of hiking before, but always with friends or in popular areas where you could count on running into someone else on the trail. This time, I chose a route that was more isolated. It wasn't completely unknown. There were online trail reports, and a few people had written about their experiences. But it was far from the usual crowded, well-maintained paths. The first day was perfect. The weather was mild, the sky clear. I made good time, following the trail as it wound through dense forest, up rocky inclines, and along the edge of steep ridges. The solitude was refreshing. There was something peaceful about hearing only the sounds of nature, birds, wind rustling through the trees, the occasional distant crack of a branch breaking under the weight of something unseen. I pushed forward, feeling confident, feeling strong. That night, I set up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. I built a fire, ate a quick meal, and stretched out in my sleeping bag, feeling content. The stars were bright above me, no light pollution to drown them out. It was beautiful. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had stirred me at first. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull glow. I listened, expecting to hear some animal moving nearby, but the night was dead silent. Not even the usual sounds of insects or owls. It was strange, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator had passed through, and everything had gone quiet in response. It was unsettling, but I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep. The second day started early. I ate, packed up, and moved on. The trail became more difficult, narrower, and less defined. The terrain was rough, and I had to check my map more often. There were no markers, no signs, nothing to indicate the path other than faint traces left by those who had walked it before. By midday, I noticed something that put me on edge: the footprints. I had assumed I was alone out here. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone. But there they were, fresh tracks in the dirt, heading in the same direction as me. They were spaced out like someone had been walking at a steady pace, not running, not stumbling. I wasn't sure why it bothered me at first. After all, it was a hiking trail. Other people had obviously used it before, but something about these prints made me uneasy. They weren't just from one person. I counted at least 2 different sets, maybe 3, and then I realized something else. The tracks weren't ahead of me, they had appeared after my own. I stopped. My heart started pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the trees, the underbrush. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the quiet stillness of the forest. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone else had started their hike that morning and just happened to be behind me. But the nagging feeling in my gut didn't go away. I started moving faster, wanting to put more distance between myself and whoever was back there. As the afternoon stretched on, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, the left path was the main route, longer but more gradual. The right path was shorter but steeper and more difficult. I hesitated, then took the steeper trail. If someone was following me, maybe this would throw them off. The climb was brutal. The incline forced me to use my hands at times, scrambling over rocks and exposed roots. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I pushed forward, determined to reach the top before stopping to rest. When I finally reached the ridge, I collapsed onto a flat rock, gulping down water. I turned to look back down the trail, half expecting to see someone following. Nothing. I exhaled, relieved. Maybe I had been overreacting. Maybe I had imagined it. Then, just as I was about to move on, something caught my eye. A movement, not on the trail below, but further back, deep in the trees. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a shadow at first, barely distinguishable from the trunks and branches. Then it moved again. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, standing perfectly still, watching me. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But where? I was already pushing myself harder than I should have. If I ran now, I could twist an ankle, get lost, make things worse. So I did the only thing I could think of. I pretended I hadn't seen them. I adjusted my pack, took a deep breath, and started walking again, forcing myself to stay calm. If they were following me, they'd know I had seen them if I panicked. I needed to act normal to keep my pace steady. I walked for another hour, maybe more. The sun was getting lower, and I needed to find a place to camp soon. But I didn't want to stop. I wanted to put as much distance between myself and whoever was out there. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A piece of fabric. It was caught on a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Dark blue, torn, weathered but not old. I moved closer, hesitated, then plucked it from the branch. It was damp, and then I saw the tracks, fresh, leading off the trail into the trees. I backed away slowly, my entire body screaming at me to get out of there. I hiked until nightfall, not stopping, not letting myself rest. When I finally set up camp, I did it quickly, keeping my fire small, staying alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I barely slept. At first light, I packed up and started moving again. My muscles ached, my body protested, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. By mid-morning, I saw something that almost made me collapse with relief. The road. A dirt path leading down to where my car was parked miles away. I picked up the pace, practically jogging the last stretch, my heart pounding. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there, breathing hard. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time. And there, just at the edge of the trees, was a figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see who it was. I peeled out of there, driving faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about being out there with nothing but my own thoughts and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt that calms me. I wouldn't say I was reckless, but I like to push myself. Longer trails, harder climbs, deeper into the wilderness. I told myself it was about proving something. Maybe that I could handle whatever nature threw at me. Maybe that I wasn't as weak as I sometimes felt in my day-to-day life. The trail I had picked this time was remote. Not exactly dangerous, but one of those places where you wouldn't run into another person unless they had set out with the same stubborn determination to escape as you had. It was a 3-day loop through rough terrain, mostly unmarked except for occasional trail markers. I had researched the route thoroughly, packed more than enough supplies, checked the weather, everything responsible hikers are supposed to do. The first day went smoothly. I made good time, following the trail along a ridgeline with stunning views of the valley below. It was the kind of solitude I craved. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I set up camp near a small stream, ate a simple meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling content. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the rustling of small animals or the occasional snap of a twig, the usual forest noises that I could ignore. This was deliberate, slow, heavy. Someone was walking just outside the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the dark. I held my breath and listened. My hand found the handle of the knife I always kept nearby when camping alone. The footsteps stopped, then a long silence. I wasn't about to unzip the tent and shine a light around. If it was an animal, I didn't want to startle it. If it was a person, well, I wasn't sure what I would do if it was a person. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed frozen, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own pulse. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to daylight filtering through the tent fabric. I unzipped the entrance carefully, half expecting something, or someone, to be waiting for me outside. But there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. No tracks. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been half asleep and paranoid. I told myself that was the case. It was easier than considering the alternatives. I packed up and started hiking again. The second day was tougher. Steeper climbs, rougher ground, but I pushed through. I forced myself to enjoy it. The weirdness of the night before lingered in the back of my mind, but I told myself I was fine. I was alone. That was what I wanted. I made camp that evening in a small clearing, ate, and tried to settle in for the night. But I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. It wasn't anything obvious, just an instinct, that deep down sense that something wasn't right. I decided to keep my knife in my hand as I lay in my sleeping bag, just in case. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear anything outside. Instead, I noticed something much worse. My tent was open. The zipper, which I had pulled all the way closed before lying down, was undone about halfway. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, every muscle locked up. I listened, but there was only silence. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing the handle of my flashlight. I clicked it on and swept the beam outside the tent. Nothing. No footprints. No movement. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. I hadn't unzipped it. I knew that for certain. And if the wind had done it, I would have heard it. Someone had been here, while I was sleeping. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening to every single sound. Every rustle of the trees, every distant animal call. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up and started moving. I abandoned my plan to complete the full loop. I just wanted to get out. I moved fast. I didn't stop for breaks, didn't even eat. I just kept going, following the trail as best as I could. But as I hiked, a slow, creeping realization settled over me. The trail markers weren't where I remembered them. I was still on a path, but something was off. I had studied the route before the trip. I had a good sense of direction, and yet, things weren't lining up. That tree, I didn't remember passing it before. That rock formation, it should have been farther south. Panic tried to take hold, but I pushed it down. I wasn't lost. I just needed to keep moving. And then I saw it. Up ahead, past a curve in the trail, was my campsite from the night before. My exact campsite. My fire pit, the indentations where my tent had been. I had been walking for hours, moving in a straight line, and somehow I was back where I started. I stood there, feeling my stomach twist into knots. This wasn't possible. I turned around, retraced my steps. I tried another direction, but an hour later, I found myself back at the same spot. That was when I saw the footprints. Not mine, fresh ones. Large, deep prints in the dirt, circling the campsite. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I felt something break inside me. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just moved downhill, always downhill, knowing that eventually I'd hit a road, a stream, something. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry. My mind was slipping into pure exhaustion. But then, finally, I saw a dirt road. I stumbled onto it, looking around wildly. No cars, no people, but it was a road, and that meant I could follow it. I walked for what felt like forever until I saw a small cabin up ahead, a ranger station. I nearly collapsed when I reached the door. A man inside looked up in surprise as I stumbled in, covered in dirt, shaking, barely able to get words out. He gave me water, let me sit down, listened as I tried to explain. I expected him to say I was imagining things, that I was just lost, confused, but he just nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Then he said, "You're not the first." I left as soon as I could, drove home, locked my doors, sat in the silence of my apartment, trying to convince myself I had overreacted. But I knew better. I don't hike alone anymore. I always liked hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the feeling of being completely cut off from everything, made me feel at ease. No phone calls, no responsibilities, just me and the trail. That's why I decided to take a solo trip to a stretch of wilderness I hadn't been to before. It was a lesser-known trail about 4 hours from my town. Not a lot of foot traffic, but enough that I figured it wasn't completely isolated. That was my mistake, assuming I knew what to expect. I arrived at the trailhead just after sunrise. My pack was heavy with supplies. Enough food for 3 days, plenty of water, a knife, a first aid kit, and my small tent. The plan was to hike about 10 miles in, camp for a night, then hike deeper into the woods before circling back. I checked my GPS and saw that I had a signal. Good. I'd let a couple of people know my plans, just in case. Safety first. The first few hours were easy. The trail was well marked, the trees provided good shade, and the temperature was perfect. Birds chirped in the distance, and I spotted a few deer watching me from behind the trees. It was peaceful. That was exactly what I had been hoping for. But something changed around midday. The trees became denser and the trail narrowed. I noticed fewer signs of wildlife. No more birds chirping, no rustling in the bushes. It was subtle, but the air felt different, heavier, like I was walking into a place that wasn't meant for me. I shook it off, blaming my imagination. Then I found the boot print. First, I was relieved. Someone else had been here. Maybe another hiker, maybe even recently. But then I noticed something odd. The print was deep, too deep for someone just walking. It looked like whoever left it had been running. I swallowed hard and kept going. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just in a hurry. But as I moved forward, I found more prints. Some were scattered, pointing in different directions. Something about them felt frantic. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination, that I wasn't looking at them right. But I picked up my pace anyway. About 2 miles later, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A torn backpack lay partially hidden under a bush, the fabric ripped wide open. The zipper had been forced apart, the contents spilling onto the ground. Granola bar wrappers, a water bottle, a flashlight with dead batteries. No ID, no name, no way to tell who it belonged to. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind me. I froze. My hand tightened around my knife. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just thick forest. But I knew what I heard. Another snap, closer this time. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm, listening. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, but beneath it, I could hear something else breathing. Slow, controlled. Someone was watching me. I made a decision. I wasn't camping here. I wasn't hiking any further. I needed to go back. I turned and started walking, forcing myself not to run. Running meant panic. Running meant noise. I moved quickly but carefully, stepping over roots and rocks, keeping my breathing steady. Every few steps, I glanced back. I saw nothing, but I felt it. The presence. The eyes on me. A mile back, I found another boot print. A new one, and it wasn't mine. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace. My pack bounced against my back, sweat rolling down my spine. My mouth was dry, my fingers tight around the knife. I didn't stop. I didn't look back anymore. I just walked faster, faster until I was practically jogging. The sun was starting to dip lower, the shadows stretching longer. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Another backpack. This one was older, covered in dirt, half buried under leaves. But it wasn't just the backpack. A few feet away, a torn jacket lay crumpled against the base of a tree. The fabric was shredded, dark stains soaked into it. And then the smell hit me. Rot. I nearly gagged, but I kept moving. Faster now, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I wasn't careful anymore. I stumbled over rocks, snapped twigs under my boots. I didn't care. I needed to get out. Then finally, I saw the trailhead in the distance. My car was parked just beyond it, a shining beacon of safety. I broke into a full sprint, lungs burning, arms pumping. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside, slamming the locks down. For a moment, I just sat there, shaking, listening to my heartbeat pound in my ears. Then I forced myself to look up. Just beyond the trees, in the fading light, I saw a figure. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. Standing still, just standing there. I didn't wait. I turned the key, started the engine, and tore out of there, gravel spraying under my tires. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away. I never reported it. Maybe I should have, but what would I say? That I found old gear? That someone might be out there? No proof, no real evidence. Just a gut feeling that if I had stayed out there one more night, I wouldn't have come back. I still hike, but never alone, never on that trail. And I always listen to that feeling in my gut. I should have turned back when I first felt it. That gut-deep sense that something wasn't right. But I kept going, thinking I was just being paranoid. I had planned this hike for weeks, and I wasn't about to let a little unease ruin it. It was early morning when I parked my truck at the trailhead. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine thick around me. The forest was still waking up, birds calling from the canopy, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. It was supposed to be a perfect day. The plan was simple: a solo hike through a remote section of the national forest, about 20 miles total. I had packed everything I needed: water, food, a map, my GPS, a knife, even bear spray just in case. I wasn't a beginner. I had done dozens of hikes like this before, but something about this one felt different. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-maintained, winding through dense pines and patches of underbrush. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air felt heavier. The silence stretched longer between bird calls. It was around the 6-mile mark that I noticed the first odd thing. A fallen tree blocked the path, which wasn't unusual after storms, but this one had been cleanly cut at both ends. Someone had dragged it there. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped over it, trying to shake the unease. Probably just some prank, I told myself. Maybe someone was trying to keep hikers out. But why? I kept moving, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees. But there was never anything there. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. I found another blockage, this time a cluster of branches woven together across the trail like a crude barrier. Again, I stepped over it and pressed on. Then I found the footprints. At first, I thought they were my own, but they were slightly larger. A man's boot prints, running parallel to mine but always a few steps off the trail, as if someone had been walking alongside me but staying hidden. My stomach twisted. I stopped, listening, barely breathing. Nothing, just the distant sound of the wind through the trees. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to that deep, primal instinct screaming at me. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old trail someone had used days ago. I kept going. The sun was high when I reached the halfway point. The plan was to eat, rest, and then start back. I found a clearing with a large rock and sat down, pulling out a protein bar and some water. That's when I heard it. A soft snap. I froze. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something deliberate. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw it. A figure barely visible through the dense foliage. Too still. Watching. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, just as suddenly as I had seen it, it was gone. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the rock beneath me. I wasn't alone. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to think. If I ran, I'd make noise. I'd be easier to track. Whoever was out there had been following me for miles. I needed to be smart. I packed up quickly, moving as quietly as I could, and started back. My pace was steady, not too fast, not too slow. I didn't want to look like I was fleeing, but every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never went away. An hour passed, then two. The sun was sinking lower, shadows stretching across the trail. I pushed forward, my legs aching, my breath tight in my chest. Then I saw something ahead that made my blood run cold. The fallen tree, the same one I had stepped over hours ago. I had been walking in circles. My throat went dry. My GPS had been tracking my route, but somehow I had looped back. That wasn't possible. I had followed the trail exactly, unless someone had led me off it. My fingers shook as I pulled out the GPS. The screen glowed, showing my position, but the marked trail was gone, just empty space where it should have been. Panic surged through me. I looked around, heart hammering. The forest was darker now, shadows swallowing the trees. I needed to get out. I forced myself to breathe, think. I still had my compass. I knew the direction of the trailhead. I just had to move. I started again, this time ignoring the trail. I pushed through the underbrush, branches snapping under my boots. Every sound felt deafening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Close. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I moved faster, my breath ragged. My body screamed in protest, but I didn't let up. Then light, faint between the trees. The parking lot. My truck. I burst through the tree line, gasping. I ran to my truck, fumbling for my keys. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped them. I threw myself inside, locking the doors. My chest heaved. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just dark, silent forest. I started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, until I saw streetlights and houses and civilization. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the quiet solitude, the rhythmic crunch of dirt beneath my boots, and the feeling of being so small in the grand scheme of nature that kept me coming back. I had been hiking for years, tackling everything from easy trails to more rugged backcountry routes. But there was one trip that changed everything for me. It was late October, right when the air had that perfect crispness, and the leaves were a mess of red, orange, and yellow. I had picked out a trail in a remote area of a national forest, one that wasn't well-traveled but had enough online reviews to make me think it was safe enough. It was about a 10-mile loop with a small, secluded lake at the midpoint. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by the lake, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. I started early, parked my car at the nearly empty trailhead, and set off. The first few miles were easy, gentle inclines, soft dirt paths, and the occasional fallen tree to step over. I passed a couple of other hikers coming back, exchanging nods but not stopping to chat. After about 4 miles, the trail started to narrow, and I had to push through dense underbrush. That's when I noticed it, a set of footprints in the dirt. Not unusual, of course, but they weren't fresh, and they were deep, like whoever had left them was carrying something heavy. What unsettled me wasn't the footprints themselves, but the fact that they didn't seem to go anywhere. They just stopped. I paused, looking around, but there was no sign of where the person had gone. I brushed it off and kept going. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip. It was beautiful, calm water reflecting the trees around it, the air completely still. I found a decent clearing near the edge and set up my tent. I made a quick dinner, watched the sunset, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. First, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavier. Someone was walking near my tent. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. I listened as the steps moved closer, slow and deliberate. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent once, then twice, and then they stopped. I didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I unzipped my tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I walked down to the lake to wash my face, I saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to my tent, then back into the woods. But not my footprints. Someone had been out there watching me. I packed up fast. I wasn't going to stick around and find out if they'd come back. The hike back started fine. The trail was quiet, and I kept a steady pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen. Nothing. But as I neared the spot where I had first seen the strange footprints, I noticed something. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. Dark, almost black, like an old jacket. I reached out to touch it, and that's when I heard it. A twig snapped. Not behind me, in front of me. Someone was on the trail ahead. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I turned, walking faster. My heart was racing. The trail was still a few miles from the parking lot, and I had no cell signal. I kept moving, listening for anything out of place. Every so often, I heard movement, quick, sharp rustling, like someone darting between trees. Then I saw it. A figure, distant but watching, dressed in dark clothes, partially hidden by the trees. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. My pack bounced against my back, my legs burning, but I didn't slow down. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and uneven, like whoever was there wasn't running full speed but wasn't walking either. They were following. The last half mile to the parking lot was the longest of my life. I ran faster than I ever had before. When I finally saw my car, I fumbled with my keys, throwing the pack into the back seat and locking the doors the second I got in. I sat there, panting, hands shaking, staring at the trailhead, waiting, nothing. After a few minutes, I started my car and pulled away, watching my mirrors the whole time. I didn't see anyone. I never reported it. What would I even say? No crime had been committed, but I never hiked alone again. I still go out on the trails, but always with someone else. And every time I hear a twig snap in the woods, my heart still races, remembering the feeling of being followed, watched, hunted. I always hike alone. It's my way of disconnecting from everything. No phones, no people, just me and the trail. That's why I decided to take a trip out to the mountains for a weekend. I wanted to push myself, go somewhere remote, far from the usual trails packed with day hikers. I picked a route that wasn't too well known. A 3-day loop through deep forest, up a ridge and down through a valley. I parked my car at a small, nearly empty lot by the trailhead. There were 2 other cars, but I didn't see anyone around. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the breeze. I strapped on my pack, checked my water, my map, and set off. The first few miles were easy, a slow incline through thick forest. The ground was covered in old pine needles, damp from the recent rain. The only sounds were my boots crunching the dirt, the occasional bird call, and the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more peaceful it felt. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I took a break. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and studied my map. My goal was to reach a ridge by sunset and camp there for the night. From what I had read, the view was supposed to be incredible. I hiked on, the trees becoming denser, the light dimming as clouds rolled in. The air turned cooler. I felt a strange stillness in the woods. The usual chatter of birds and insects had faded. It was just me and the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't alarming, just unusual. As I climbed higher, the trail grew rougher. The dirt gave way to loose rock, making each step more careful. A slip here could mean a twisted ankle or worse. I moved slow, testing each step. The sun was getting low, the trees casting long shadows. I had maybe an hour of daylight left when I reached the ridge. The view was just as promised. Endless rolling hills stretched in every direction, their peaks dusted in mist. I could see a river snaking through the valley far below, a thin silver ribbon against the green. I set up camp just off the trail, clearing a flat patch for my tent. As I worked, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. It had a strange, hollow sound to it, like it was moving through something unseen. I brushed it off and got a fire going. Dinner was simple, dehydrated food and more water. As the darkness settled, I felt the familiar calm that came with being alone in nature. Then I heard it. A single, sharp crack echoed through the trees. A branch breaking. It was close, too close. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the fire crackling. Probably just an animal, I told myself. But I kept my headlamp close, my knife closer. I sat by the fire for another hour, scanning the darkness. My nerves settled, but I still felt uneasy. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there listening. The wind had died down, but the forest was still too quiet. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sudden jolt or a nightmare, just a slow drift into consciousness. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then the zipper of my tent shifted slightly, as if someone had barely touched it. I grabbed my knife. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? No, this was different. This was human. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle tensed. Minutes passed, the longest minutes of my life. Then the footsteps started again, moving away, slowly fading into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light hit, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, knife still in hand. The ground was disturbed, but not by animal tracks. Footprints, human footprints circling my tent. A chill ran through me. My brain tried to reason it out. Maybe another hiker had gotten lost? But who hikes at night without a light, without calling out? No, this wasn't normal. I packed up fast. I had planned to continue the loop, but there was no way I was staying out here another night. I decided to take a shorter route back, cutting through the valley. It would still take most of the day, but I'd be back at my car before dark. The hike down was brutal. My legs were shaky, my nerves shot. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. Every rustle of leaves made my stomach tighten. A few miles in, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small campsite, abandoned. A tent half collapsed, its rain fly missing. A backpack torn open, its contents scattered. A cooking pot, rusted and overturned. And a boot, just one, lying on its side in the dirt. It looked like it had been here for weeks, maybe months. I didn't stop. I didn't investigate. I just kept moving. By the time I reached my car, the sky was darkening again. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding all day. I don't hike alone anymore. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the isolation, the silence, the feeling of being completely detached from the world. It gave me peace. I never really worried about the dangers of hiking solo. I knew my limits, carried enough supplies, and always told someone where I was going. But that one trip changed everything. I had planned a weekend hike through a remote trail deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be about 20 miles round trip, with some moderate elevation gain, nothing too extreme. I had checked the weather forecast, packed accordingly, and made sure my gear was in order. My backpack held all the essentials: plenty of water, protein bars, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and a knife. I also carried a GPS device and a paper map as a backup. The trail started off well, winding through thick forest with towering pines and patches of wildflowers. The air smelled fresh, crisp, untouched. I enjoyed the rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt, the occasional rustling of small animals darting through the underbrush. The sun filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns of light across the trail. It was perfect. About 6 miles in, I noticed the trail getting narrower. The trees grew closer together, the undergrowth thicker. It wasn't unusual for trails to be overgrown in lesser traveled areas, so I kept moving forward. But there was something else, something off. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds chirping, leaves rustling, and distant insects buzzing had faded. It was the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I shook it off and pushed forward. I was used to solitude, to the eerie quiet of the wilderness. But there was something unnatural about this silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, I caught a strange smell in the air. It was faint at first, but as I kept walking, it got stronger. It was rancid, thick, almost metallic, like decaying meat. My stomach twisted. Dead animals weren't uncommon in the wild, but this smell was overwhelming, unnatural. I tried to ignore it and moved faster, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was rotting nearby. Then I saw it. About 10 feet off the trail, just beyond a cluster of shrubs, something large was lying on the ground. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just one animal. It was several: a deer, a raccoon, and what looked like a fox, all piled together. Their bodies were torn apart, but not by scavengers. The wounds were too clean, too precise. They weren't just attacked. They were placed there. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had done this. I backed away slowly, my breath quickening. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to go back the way I came. But I had already covered 6 miles, and my planned campsite was just a few more ahead. I convinced myself it was probably some predator's horde, maybe a mountain lion or a bear. Still, something about it felt deliberate. I forced myself to keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, scanning the trees behind me. But there was nothing, just that suffocating silence. As the sun dipped lower, I reached the clearing where I had planned to set up camp. It was a small open space near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by trees. I quickly pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and got a small fire going. The warmth and light made me feel a little better, but the unease never fully left me. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound had me on edge. The crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all felt too close, too intentional. I kept my knife within reach, my ears straining for anything unusual. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light sleep. Then I woke up. Something had snapped a branch just outside my tent. I froze, barely breathing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I reached for my knife and sat up, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around my campsite. Not an animal, something heavier. Person. I stayed completely still, gripping my knife so tightly my fingers ached. I listened as the footsteps circled my tent, stopping just outside the entrance. I could hear breathing low, steady, just beyond the thin fabric. Then silence. Minutes passed. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Finally, I reached out and slowly unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow across the clearing. The trees stood still, unmoving, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first light, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I forced myself to move carefully, quietly. I started back down the trail, trying not to think about the fact that someone might still be out there, watching. About halfway back, I noticed something on the trail ahead. My stomach dropped. Footprints. Fresh ones. Large, deep, made by boots. They weren't there yesterday. They followed the trail, the same path I was taking out. But here's what made my blood run cold. They weren't coming in. They were going out. Someone had been behind me the whole time. I moved faster, pushing myself to keep a steady pace. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. When I finally reached my car, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sped off, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I felt like I was being followed? That someone or something was out there watching? That a pile of mutilated animals had been left along the trail? There was no evidence, nothing concrete. Just a gut-deep certainty that I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I should have known better than to go alone. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. Nothing crazy, just a little escape into the mountains. I had done this kind of thing before, plenty of times, but always with a group. This time, I just wanted the solitude. No schedules, no small talk, just me and the trail. I checked the weather, packed everything I needed, even let my brother know where I'd be. Standard stuff. No part of me thought this trip would be different. The trail I chose wasn't a well-known one. That was the appeal. It ran through a section of national forest that was technically open to hikers but not maintained. No signs, no markers, no real path beyond what had been worn in by the few people who had bothered to come through over the years. I found it on an old forum post. Some guy had mentioned it in passing, said it was serene, isolated, and a little tough to navigate. Perfect. I parked my truck at the base of an old fire road, locked everything up, hoisted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was rough, overgrown in spots, but nothing I couldn't handle. Birds whined through the trees, the sound of my boots crunching over loose dirt. Peaceful. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something was off. It was subtle at first. I had this weird feeling, like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see another hiker. But I was alone. Nothing but trees and silence behind me. I brushed it off, just my brain playing tricks on me. Then I started finding things. The first was a pile of bones. Small ones, mostly, scattered just off the trail, picked clean. At first, I thought maybe a coyote had left them there, but something about the way they were arranged, almost in a loose, circular pattern, didn't sit right with me. I took a picture on my phone, told myself it was nothing, and kept moving. The second thing was a rope. Just a length of old, frayed rope, tangled in a bush. It looked like it had been cut. Again, not inherently weird, but it made me uneasy. I moved past it quickly. The sun was getting low, and I still hadn't found a good place to set up camp. I kept going, pushing a little farther than I had planned, hoping to find a clearing or a good flat spot. That's when I found the footprints. They were fresh, not boot prints, bare feet. Human. They crossed the trail at an angle, disappearing into the trees. I stopped and listened, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet it had become. No wind, no birds, just my own breathing. I should have turned back right then. I should have trusted my gut, but I didn't. Instead, I told myself it was probably just some weird coincidence. Maybe a camper who had wandered barefoot near their site. It didn't make sense, but I didn't want to freak myself out. I walked another mile before I found a decent spot to camp. It was a little clearing, just big enough for my tent, surrounded by thick trees. I set up quickly, made a small fire, cooked a meal, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The night came fast. The fire crackled, casting long shadows. I ate in silence, staring into the dark. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A branch snapped. Close. I froze, listening. Another snap, then a rustling sound. Something moving through the brush. Not an animal. Too steady, too deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods. For the next hour, I sat there, barely breathing, straining to hear anything over the pounding in my chest. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, faint movement, a whisper of sound that might have been the wind, or might not have been. At some point, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, knife in hand, eyes wide open. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, heart hammering. Something was outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. A faint shuffling sound. Then the zipper of my tent twitched. I lunged, grabbing the handle from inside, yanking it down hard. Silence. I held my breath, listening. Whatever it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting for the sun. When it finally came, I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. No breakfast, no lingering. Just shoved everything into my pack and got moving. The way back felt different. The woods felt wrong. Every sound made my skin crawl. My eyes darted to every shadow, every movement between the trees. Halfway back, I saw them again, the footprints. This time, they were alongside mine, following me. My stomach dropped. I started moving faster. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Piece of rope. The same frayed rope from yesterday, but this time it was tied around a tree. At eye level, a noose. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life, pack slamming against my back, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Threw my gear in, jumped in, locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. As I sped down the fire road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just for a second, I thought I saw something at the tree line. A figure, still, watching. I didn't look again. I drove straight home, locked every door, and didn't sleep for 2 days. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the pictures on my phone, the one of the bones was gone. Just an empty spot where it should have been. I don't go hiking alone anymore. I always loved hiking alone. It gave me time to clear my head, to breathe, to escape from everything. I never thought much about the risks. I was careful, I was prepared, and I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. At least that's what I thought. This time, I picked a trail I had never been on before. It was a little more remote than my usual routes, but that was what I wanted: seclusion, peace, no distractions. The reviews online mentioned that it was lightly trafficked, had beautiful scenery, and stretched about 12 miles in a loop. I had the whole day to myself, so I figured I'd take my time. The weather was perfect: cool morning air, a light breeze, and the scent of damp earth from the rain a few days before. I started early, just as the sun was creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. The trailhead was empty, which didn't surprise me. A weekday hike in the off-season, I'd probably have the whole place to myself. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail wound through thick trees, the sound of birds and rustling leaves the only noise besides my footsteps. I stopped a few times to take pictures. Not for social media or anything, just for myself. Something about capturing a moment always made it feel more real to me. As I moved deeper into the forest, the path got narrower, the trees denser. It wasn't anything unusual. Some trails were just like that. I checked my GPS a few times to make sure I was still on track. Everything was fine. A few hours in, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break. I sat on a fallen tree, had some water, and ate a protein bar while enjoying the silence. That was when I noticed it, the first sign that something wasn't right. There was another path leading away from the clearing, barely visible through the undergrowth. It wasn't on my map. It looked old, overgrown, like it hadn't been used in a long time. A game trail, maybe, but it was wider than that, almost like it had once been a real hiking path. I felt a strange pull toward it, a mix of curiosity and unease. But I wasn't stupid, I stuck to my planned route. I kept hiking, but that feeling of unease didn't fade. Something about the forest felt off. The air was still too still. The usual background noise of birds and insects had quieted. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was psyching myself out over nothing. A few miles later, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine, not fresh, but recent enough that the rain hadn't washed them away completely. They were deep, spaced far apart. Someone had come this way, moving fast. Running, maybe. I tried to ignore the pit forming in my stomach. There was nothing inherently weird about seeing footprints on a hiking trail, but something about them unsettled me. I picked up my pace. The sooner I finished the loop, the better. But the deeper I went, the more things felt wrong. The trail seemed different than what was on my map, twisting in ways it shouldn't, leading me through areas that didn't match what I had researched. My GPS was still tracking me on the route, but my gut told me otherwise. The trees felt like they were closing in, the light filtering through the canopy growing dimmer even though it wasn't late. Then I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. A torn piece of fabric was caught on a low branch, dark blue, almost black, like denim. My first thought was that it belonged to another hiker, maybe the one who left the footprints. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. It was stained with something dark. I told myself it was dirt, nothing more. I kept moving, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. I wasn't afraid, not yet, but I was uneasy in a way that I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was overthinking everything. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, almost unnoticeable beneath the damp earth and pine. But as I kept walking, it grew stronger. Metallic, sour. Blood. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensing. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to get out. But I was miles from my car, and I had no idea if I could find a faster way back. I swallowed my fear and pressed on, my steps cautious, my breathing controlled. I didn't want to see what was ahead, but I had no choice. The smell led me to another clearing, smaller than the first. And that's when I saw it. A backpack, half buried in leaves and dirt. The fabric was slashed open, its contents spilling out. Clothes, a water bottle, a smashed phone. And beside it, the footprints. This time, there were two sets. One set, deep and erratic, like someone had been running. The other, larger, heavier, following close behind. Something had happened here, something bad. I turned, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I did, I heard something. A twig snapping. Not from behind me, but ahead. Someone was there. I didn't wait to see who. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Didn't care about my GPS or my supplies. I just ran, crashing through the undergrowth, heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw something familiar. The trailhead. My car was still there, the only one in the lot. I stumbled toward it, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the empty trail. But I knew I wasn't alone. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I locked my doors, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I never reported what I found. Maybe I should have. Maybe someone else went missing after that. But I couldn't do it. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to know more than I already did. I still hike, but never alone, and never on a trail I don't know.